Chapter 241, Astonishing Discovery. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Master, who is this? The royally dressed lady asked. 5 well-dressed bodyguards also stood behind this royally dressed maiden in addition to the 2 young maids. One of these 5 men was more or less a 40-year-old man. He seemed to be heading this group. His complexion was dark, and a look of experience could be seen on his face. His eyes were often hovering towards the surrounding. Princess, this is my close friend Shi Mu. And, this is Princess Uni of the Lu Shan Kingdom, Luan introduced them to each other. It's my pleasure to meet Her Royal Highness Princess Uni. Shi Mu didn't reveal an unbelievable expression on his face. He walked over at a moderate pace, and greeted her. You don't have to be over-courteous. Your Excellency seems to be a close friend of Master Lu. Are you also a big expert in the field of precious mirrors? Princess Uni's elegant eyes swept over Shi Mu and Cai who sat on his shoulder as she asked. Brother Shi isn't an expert in the field of precious mirror. However, he has some unique insights into the martial arts. Oh, that's right. I happen to have some crucial matters that I wanted to consult Brother Shi over. So, is it all right to walk together? Luan didn't wait for Shi Mu to give a reply as he opened his mouth and said. Oh, Master can do as he pleases. Princess Uni lost her interest and turned her eyes away when she heard these words. Shi Mu's brows creased slightly. He was about to say something. But, Luan's voice resounded near his ear before he could do anything. Shi Mu was dumbfounded. He threw his gaze towards the garret's door, and didn't speak anything. Princess Uni had already turned around by this time. She crossed the long queue, and walked directly to the entrance of the sparkling gem pavilion. The maids and the escorts followed behind her. Shi Mu and Luan also followed them while having a casual discussion. So, these 2 men also appeared like Princess Uni's bodyguards. One of the escorts showed an order token at the entrance of the sparkling gem pavilion. After that, the security guards and the disciples of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult allowed them to pass through. Shi Mu also followed after Princess Uni's group, and walked straight into the sparkling gem pavilion. However, he also noticed something before he walked in. He saw that everyone had to pay 5 low-grade spirit stones as an admission fee to enter the sparkling gem pavilion's auction. The admission fee was almost equivalent to 2 lakhs in silver. So, this fee was sufficient to keep many people out of the door. He estimated that there were at least 10,000 people who had entered the sparkling gem pavilion today. Many of them had obviously gathered here to enrich their knowledge and experience only. However, this admission fee was enough to collect several thousands in spirit stones in a day. A magnificently decorated and considerably spacious hall appeared in front of Shi Mu as he stepped into the first floor of the sparkling gem pavilion. The hall was expansive enough to accommodate nearly 10,000 people at a time. It was resplendent in its glowing golden and green ambience. Also, it had an extraordinary style to its design. It was still early morning. So, there were barely 500 or 600 people in the hall at this time. They were either standing or sitting. Most of them had formed groups of 3 or 5, and were chatting in a casual manner. The stream of people that was gushing in from the 4 entrances was mostly going to the next floor through the stairs on both sides. Shi Mu learned something from the discussion he had just had with Luan. He was informed that the Heavenly Wu Chamber of Commerce would set up a large number of shops every time before the beginning of the Ascension to Immortality auction. These shops were arranged in the sparkling gem pavilion from the 3rd floor to the 8th floor. They precisely rent out these shops to gather many chambers of commerce and sects in one place. Moreover, they charged a considerable amount of money in rent. However, it was still quite difficult to find a shop here. The reason was very simple. The people who had the confidence to participate in the Ascension to Immortality auction were obviously very wealthy people and families. But, there were also a large number of people who wanted to participate in this auction in order to enhance their experience. And, these people clearly knew that they could never afford to bid for the precious treasures of the auction. Therefore, they would often choose to settle for the next best thing. And, they would normally end up purchasing some other stuff from these shops before the auction would begin. So, it was only obvious why the business of these shops would soar to the sky. This heavenly Wu Chamber of Commerce really knows how to make money, Shi Mu thought. Princess Yuni and her group didn't stop here. They went to a private room on the second floor through the side doors corridor. This room seemed to be reserved for some high-status people. Shi Mu bid farewell to Luan, and stayed alone in the first floor's hall. Shi Mu gazed at the receding silhouette of these people as they gradually disappeared into the end of the corridor. Then, he walked toward the other side of the staircase. How did this person suddenly become the princess's staff? Cai crooked his head as he asked. Who knows? Don't think about other people's business. Let's go, Shi Mu replied. Shi Mu had drawn a lot of middle-grade magic charms in this past month. He had retained a little amount of these magic charms for his personal use, but he had exchanged most of them for spirit stones. So, he now had 5 middle-grade spirit stones, and 120 or so low-grade spirit stones. But, they were still considered a very trivial number of magic charms. Therefore, Shi Mu's plan was to go upstairs and stroll around first. He wanted to see whether there was an appropriate thing for him over there. Shi Mu appeared at the entrance of the third floor's hall after some time. This was an open-style hall. It was 2,000 feet or so in size. It appeared quite spacious. There were many shops inside this hall, and they were arranged in a neat and uniform manner. The hall was bustling with a large number of people. So, each shop had a lot of people. Shi Mu drifted with the stream of people for a few moments. Then, he squeezed into a shop which was selling magic tools. An hour passed. Shi Mu walked out from a big specialist store that sold pills. It was set up on the 6th floor. A hint of excitement could be seen across his face at this moment. The fact was Shi Mu had unexpectedly discovered that this shop also had all Yang pills on sale. All Yang pill was also used to practice Yang attributes cultivation arts or magic art. It was comparatively more expensive than the amassing Yang Dan. In fact, 1 low-grade spirit stone was needed in exchange for a pill. However, its effect was also far better than the amassing Yang Dan. Shi Mu had calculated for a moment. And, he had considered the potential price of the evil ape's blood essence at the auction that would follow. After that, he spent 20 low-grade spirit stones to purchase 20 all Yang pills. He could start the practice of the art of breeding a strong evil ape's 6th stage if he succeeded in taking hold of the evil ape's blood essence in the auction. Half an hour later, Shi Mu stood in an ancient bookshop on the 7th floor. There were books and jade slips of some common magic charms, magic arts, and cultivation arts in that store. In addition, there were also numerous maps and other stuff that contained the introduction and details of the Eastern continent. Shi Mu rummaged through them for some time. After that, he spent 20 or more low-grade spirit stones to buy a map of the Eastern continent, and the Book of a Fire Attribute Magic Cultivation Art Fundamental Book of Fire. This cultivation art contained a few common methods of practicing and refining magic power. In addition, it also contained a number of fire attribute magic techniques. Shi Mu was about to leave. But then, his eyes fell on a dusty and old animal skin. It had a design on it. However, it was kept in the corner of a shelf. A few words Western continent could be vaguely seen on it. His heart thumped when he saw it. So, he walked over. Shi Mu returned to the first floor's auction hall after half an hour. The auction was about to start soon. Almost 10,000 people had gathered in the hall. So, the hall was almost packed. The first few rows were bustling with noise and excitement, they looked very lively. Shi Mu found an empty seat somewhere in the last rows, and sat down. Then, he turned his hand and took out that old animal skin drawing in order to examine it. He then started to study it with great interest. It was the topographical map of the Western continent. Shi Mu had found this in the corner of the shop. This map's illustration appeared a little rough. It had roughly outlined the contours of the western continent. In addition, it only portrayed a few other places. He had bought this map entirely out of curiosity. He only wanted to confirm whether this continent genuinely existed or not. Suddenly, his eyes drew towards a mountain peak marked in the center of the map. This map's description made it seem as if this peak was extremely lofty. The topography of the mountain was quite steep. In fact, it seemed as if a smooth stone pillar would be soaring straight into the sky. This mountain was known as Rising to the Heaven Peak. Shi Mu's heart thumped. This description reminded him of something. He had recently had the dream of the white ape when he had slept in front of that small mountain peak. He had seen the white ape sitting on a peak then. Moreover, that peak from his dreamland bore a resemblance to the peak that was marked on this map. Shi Mu wanted to study it again. But then, a burst of crisp sound of a copper bell reverberated in the entire hall. Shi Mu raised his head and looked forward. He found that a considerably large purplish-red table was already placed on the high and round platform at the center of the hall. In addition, a middle-aged Confucian scholar stood behind this wooden table. He had a long and black beard. There was a very profound aura around this man. He was surprisingly an earth-ranked powerhouse. Friends from all corners of the country, our Heavenly Wu Chamber of Commerce is pleased to welcome our chief guest Elder Wu Yanglun. We are honored to have the privilege of him presiding over this year's Ascension to Immortality auction, the middle-aged Confucian scholar spoke up. After that, he cupped his hands across his chest, and bowed towards the audience as a part of the ritual. His voice couldn't be considered very loud. But, it reached everyone's ears very clearly. Consequently, it made the entire hall quiet down. As you all know, the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult's Ascension to Immortality ceremony is conducted once in every 30 years. And, our Chamber of Commerce's Ascension to Immortality auction is also held after the same interval. This is the 50th time we are conducting this auction. We have never disappointed our friends who come from distant places. And, this time won't be an exception either. We will proceed as per the convention, and I'll first showcase the last treasure of this auction since I believe that many of my friends would have come here for this treasure alone. The middle-aged scholar tried to lighten the atmosphere of the hall. He had only said a few words, but this had drawn everyone's vision towards him. The middle-aged scholar's voice had barely faded when a ray of light flashed in his hand. Then, a palm-sized golden-colored small brocade box appeared in his hand. He slowly opened the box, and revealed a fingernail-sized fiery red-colored stone that lay quietly in the box. A fine dark red line could be vaguely seen on the surface of the stone. It was flickering slightly, and it seemed as if it was alive. Shi Mu's heart couldn't endure but skip a beat as he saw this thing in that small brocade box. Wasn't this the mysterious stone that Shi Mu had obtained in the relics of the portal of the brave warrior in those days? Moreover, the stone that he had obtained was almost fist-sized. In fact, it was far bigger than the stone in this small box. Many of my friends have already spoken out its name. That's right, this thing is the Star Stone. It's an ancient spirit stone that has the ability to stabilize the space channels. It has an endlessly incredible usage. However, I'll keep the initial bidding price a secret for the time being. The middle-aged Confucian scholar twirled his long beard in his fingers as he said with a smile. His voice had barely faded, but it had already sparked uproar in the entire hall. And, the people's voices grew louder with each passing second. Some of the surrounding people knew about this stone. Hence, they began to boast around. But, there were some people who were totally unaware of it. So, they started to ask around to gather details. Well, let's move to the next stuff. It's the first product of this auction. The middle-aged Confucian scholar looked pretty satisfied with the current mood of the people. He then opened his mouth and said again. He closed the small brocade box, and kept it on the table. Then, a beam of light again gleamed in his hand, and a section of purple-colored withered wood appeared. The wood was as thick as an adult's calf. It's 100-year-ago purple fragrant wood. It has been grown in the depths of Mount Pan in the southern continent where various kinds of poisonous insects reside. It can accommodate a massive amount of spiritual energy. It's a good material for refining high-quality magic brush. It can even enhance the success rate of drawing magic charms by at least 10%. The price of this wood is 60 low-grade spirit stones. Also, each subsequent bid should be higher than the previous bid by at least 10 spirit stones, the middle-aged Confucian scholar announced in an unhurried and patient manner. Magic charms were considered one of the most commonly used methods to confront an enemy. This piece of wood could enhance one's success rate only by 10%. Even so, it piqued the interest of many people. 70 spirit stones. 90. I quote 100. The price continued to rise 7 or 8 times in a row. Eventually, it was bought by a school-uniformed man at a price of 190 spirit stones. The final bidder had quoted the price that was thrice the initial price of the product. And, the atmosphere of the hall had turned quite fervent after this. The auction proceeded. The majority of the things displayed here were rare things from the outside world. Shi Mu saw that another product of the auction was also taken away by another person. Shi Mu looked tranquil on the surface. But, he was dumbstruck deep in his heart. He had realized a wondrous usage of spirit stones. A person could purchase anything at this auction, whether it was a high-grade magic tool, or some rare pills, or some ancient books of cultivation arts, as long as he possessed enough spirit stones. In addition, he also found that things related to magicians were often sold at considerably high prices. He then saw a blue gemstone necklace that had the ability to increase the water attribute element induction force of the user by twice. It was bided for more than 10 times in a row. Then, it was eventually bagged by Princess Uni at an astonishing price of 2,300 spirit stones. However, this was an auction of an ordinary product. The final product of this auction was the Star Stone. Wouldn't the bidding price of the Star Stone be far higher? Shi Mu's heart fluttered with a fit of inexplicable excitement as he thought of the fist-sized Star Stone he possessed in his storage ring. Chapter 242, The Duo Plays a Cheap Trick. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. The next product for the auction is a bottle of blood essence of a red-tailed macaque monkey. It is a Xian level ominous beast. It's a rare material for making magic charms. The base price of this product is 100 low-grade spirit stones. Also, each subsequent bid should be higher than the previous bid by at least 20 spirit stones. Shi Mu sat up with his back straight when he heard these words. The trace of an exhilarated look also flashed through his eyes. He then saw that the middle-aged Confucian scholar who was in the center of the hall held up a yellow calabash-like vial in his hand. He then started to showcase it in all directions. Shi Mu restrained his excitement deep in his heart. But, he didn't come up with his bid in an impatient manner. He rather decided to be a spectator in the beginning. The extracted blood of apes and monkeys class Xian ominous beast was considered very scarce. Therefore, there were many people in the hall who knew about it and its importance. Consequently, people started to make their bids one after another. Soon, the quoted price rose to 260 low-grade spirit stones. Eventually, nobody came forward to raise the bidding price any further. 280 spirit stones, Shi Mu opened his mouth and said. 300 spirit stones, the voice that had been scrambling over this item rang out again. 320 spirit stones, Shi Mu countered. The voice that had been competing so far finally turned silent, and subsequently gave up. There are no further bids. So, the extracted blood essence of this Xian red-tailed macaque monkey ultimately turns over to this friend who quoted the final price, the middle-aged Confucian scholar said. Shi Mu's face gleamed with the trace of a blissful smile. It was apparent that he could ascend a step further in the art of breeding a strong evil ape now. I put forth 340 spirit stones. Suddenly, a voice resounded in the hall. It seemed somewhat familiar to Shi Mu. Shi Mu turned his head and looked towards the source of the voice. He saw a familiar figure in the front row. He was dressed in blue clothes. He was Shentuk Wang, and he belonged to an influential family. Moreover, he was the same man who had been pestering Zhong Xiu before. Shentuk Wang also turned around. It seemed as if had felt Shi Mu's stare. He then flashed a mild smile to Shi Mu. There was a touch of a provocative expression in his eyes. 400 spirit stones, Shi Mu countered. Many people in the hall issued a loud shout in excitement. The extracted blood essence of a Xian level ominous beast was quite a rare and precious thing. However, the current bid price was slightly on the higher side. Therefore, many surrounding people began to talk about it. 420 spirit stones, Shentuk Wang spoke up at a moderate pace. 500 spirit stones, Shi Mu said after a little hesitation. 520 spirit stones, Shentuk Wang countered. The droning sound of people's discussion increased as this happened. Some people looked into Shi Mu's eyes, and noticed that a thoughtful expression was floating therein. Shi Mu's complexion sank. He didn't spring up to speak anything in response. This price was already the bottom line that he could bear. Shi Mu, I am infuriated now. The spirit stones are indeed incredible. Cai squatted on Shi Mu's shoulder. He then whispered while staring at Shentuk Wang. Is there anyone who wants to bid again? The middle-aged Confucian scholar looked at Shi Mu as he asked. Shentuk Wang also turned his head and looked into Shi Mu's eyes in a ridiculing manner. A moment passed, but no new offer was made. Well, I would request this young master to come over here. This red-tailed macaque's blood belongs to you now, the middle-aged Confucian scholar said. Shentuk Wang shot a glance at Shi Mu in a contemptuous manner. Then, an air of complacency surrounded him as he walked over in front of the middle-aged Confucian scholar. He threw a small bag of spirit stones, and received the yellow vial. After that, a ray of light flashed in his hand, and the vial vanished into thin air. The auction picked up its pace as usual after this small interlude. And the subsequent products of auction also grew increasingly rare with the lapse of time. And the atmosphere of the hall gradually became fervent to its maximum limit. Moreover, often the subsequent items for auction had to go through a very intense competition before the dust would eventually settle. Shi Mu's heart fluttered with excitement several times during this period. But he didn't have enough spirit stones in his bag to make his bids. Suddenly, he raised his head and looked over his head. He clearly felt a faint fluctuation in the space. It was very weak. However, it seemed as if air was rippling over the surrounding people's head in this hall. The fluctuations in space couldn't be sensed by those who didn't have spatial element induction force. In fact, it was difficult to sense even for those whose own strength and the potency of this spirit sense was quite formidable. Shi Mu swept his vision around the hall, and felt as if only he could sense the strangeness that prevailed in the hall. What happened? Shi Tiu? Cai asked since he had noticed that Shi Mu's expression had changed. Shi Mu shook his head, but didn't speak anything. Then, Shi Mu's pupils suddenly congealed, and he saw a person's silhouette walking out of Princess Yuni's private room that was on the second floor of the hall. This individual had long red hair. This person was Luan. Luan then glanced at the clamorous crowd around him, and a strange look emerged in his eyes. But it only stayed there for a fleeting moment before it faded away. Then, he walked towards the exit of the hall with an expressionless face. That trace of strange look had stayed in Luan's eyes for a split second only. But it was still captured by Shi Mu. A faint golden gleam flashed in Shi Mu's eyes as he watched Luan's silhouette fade into the exit door. An idea rolled through his mind the next moment. He pondered for a moment. Then, he stood up and walked over to the other exit. Shi Tiu, are we heading back? Cai asked. Shi Mu let out a groan in a gentle manner. Then, he sped up his footsteps. A sense of inexplicable palpitation was faintly lingering in his heart. Stop! Shi Mu was about to step out of the hall's exit. But then, a few figures suddenly appeared in front of him and blocked his path. The leader of this small group was a blue-dressed man. He was actually Shentu Guang. "What's the matter with you people?" Shi Mu inquired. "This thing. Mr. Shi seems to want it very badly." Shentu Guang waved his hand and a yellow vial appeared in his hand. It was the same bottle of blood essence of an ominous ape that had been auctioned a while ago. However, Shi Mu didn't speak anything. He only gazed at Shentu Guang. "This thing is useless to me. But, Your Excellency wants it badly. So, we can talk about it." Shentu Guang spoke up with a broad smile. "It looks like Mr. Shentu has a proposition. It would be better if you get right to the point and speak out instead of following the roundabout method," Shi Mu replied. "Well, I won't beat about the bush since it turns out that Mr. Shi is also a straightforward man. I bought this bottle of blood essence only because I wanted to exchange it for Your Excellency's parrot. What do you say?" Shentu Guang stated. Shi Mu was struck dumb for a moment as he heard his words. He then glanced at Cai on his shoulder, and a silhouette flashed through his mind. He immediately understood the crux of this matter. "Well, I earnestly wish for this too. And, there is no benefit in following this sinister man, Shi Tou. He doesn't even give me delicious food to eat. But, this new young master seems to be an outstanding man. Also, his family has tons of wealth. So, I presume that he won't treat me like Shi Tou does." Cai didn't wait for Shi Mu to open his mouth. He quickly jumped in and shouted. "Haha, I will surround you with loads of delicious foods." Shentu Guang was exhilarated as he heard this. He then looked at Shi Mu in a mocking manner, and said with a loud laughter. Shentu Gunig's companions also burst into a loud laughter. Shi Mu's complexion turned red and blue out of anger. He then shot a furious look at the parrot. "Fine, I agree," Shi Mu spat out these words from the gap between his teeth. Cai shot a contemptuous glance at Shi Mu. Then, he spread its wings and flew over to Shentu Guang's shoulder in a cheerful manner. "Mr. Shi, please receive this thing then. I will get this good bird a nice tree house, and lots of good food. I will keep you very happy." A smile gleamed across Shentu Guang's face as he tossed the yellow bottle gourd towards Shi Mu. After that, he patted Cai in a gentle manner. Shi Mu's complexion turned unsightly. He resentfully looked at Shentu Guang and his companions once. Then, he strode toward the exit. A burst of laughter resounded again from behind. It also had a touch of ridicule to it. Shentu Guang contemptuously watched Shi Mu's silhouette step out of the hall. And, his heart overwhelmed with happiness when he remembered how he had been humiliated by Shi Mu twice before. "You are called Cai, right? Follow me from now on. You can get whatever you want to eat if you stay obedient to me," Shentu Guang said to Cai. Cai nodded in a repetitive manner as if a chicken pecking rice grains. "However, you have to do me a favor as well. You will have to make Miss Zhongxiu fall in love with me," Shentu Guang spoke up. "No problem. It's a piece of cake for me. Just leave this matter to me," Cai patted his wings and replied while sticking his chest out. Shentu Guang's brimmed with exultation as he heard his reply. "However, let me tell you one thing straight. I'm a noble parrot. And, I don't want to be closed in a cage," Cai added. Shentu Guang nodded in agreement without thinking about this matter for a second. "Brother Shentu, the auction is still going on. There is the possibility that they may continue to auction a lot of good things. Let's go back quickly." A yellow-robed man looked all fired up as he said in an urging manner. Shentu Guang was already in a blissful mood. So, he waved his hand and returned to the hall along with his group. In fact, there were many things that he still wanted to buy at today's auction. Shi Mu stood on a crowded street outside the auction hall. And, that street seemed like an endless stream of people. He let out a soft breath. The wisp of inexplicable palpitation had also disappeared from his heart by now. He stood motionless on the street. It seemed as if he was waiting for something. A shadow flew over from the third floor of the sparkling gem pavilion after some time. It hovered in the air for a moment. Then, it flew toward Shi Mu. It was none other than Cai. Haha, that fool was too easy to swindle. I only executed our plan. Then, I came back. Cai landed on Shi Mu's shoulder and laughed out loud. Shi Mu flashed a mild smile. Shi Tou. You were lucky to have a quick-witted bird like me in this instance. You didn't spend a single spirit stone. Still, you grabbed that bottle of ape's blood essence. How do you want to thank me? Cai said. These two had already communicated with each other to make a plan. They had then collaborated to play a cheap trick with Shen Guang. Well, you indeed rendered a meritorious service this time, Shi Mu smiled. He was about to say a couple of words to applaud Cai. However, something strange happened all of a sudden. A dazzling blood light flashed from the sparkling gem pavilion. The blood light then shone from all four exit corridors of the meeting hall. It seemed as if a blood-red sun had appeared in the hall. Moreover, it also seemed that the source of this glaring blood light was the auction hall on the first floor. The pedestrians on the street also began to stop one after another. They seemed awestruck as they looked towards the sparkling gem pavilion. They started to point their fingers, and started to talk about it spiritedly. They didn't know what had happened in the sparkling gem pavilion. But, the blood light was sufficient for them to conclude that it wasn't an auspicious sign. Shi Mu's complexion also changed as he looked at the scene in the front. He sensed that the glaring blood light was permeated with a kind of intense and dreadful murderous aura. In fact, it was very cold and gloomy. Moreover, he also felt that this dreadful aura had the same unique feeling that he had felt in the dead spirit world. Is it possible that the image of an assassin-like figure appeared in Shi Mu's mind? It was actually Lu An's silhouette. The security guards and the disciples of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult stood outside the four doors of the sparkling gem pavilion. And, they also noticed this strange change. Consequently, their complexion changed very drastically in quick succession. A young bodyguard attempted to burst into the meeting hall from the east exit. But, he was stopped by a nearby middle-aged security guard. Don't worry. It's the sparkling gem pavilion. There are a few people inside who can handle everything properly if something has happened inside the building. We only need to do our duty, and that is guard the exits, the middle-aged guard spoke up. The middle-aged guard's voice had barely fallen when he heard a loud ear-piercing howl. And, he was thrown backwards the next moment. A large and sharp bone spear had pierced through the middle-aged guard's chest. It had then nailed his body to the wall of the exit. Chapter 243, A Frightening Change at the Venue. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. The middle-aged security guard opened his mouth, and it seemed as if he wanted to scream aloud. But, the bone spear that had pierced his body was too thick. So, it had curbed most of his life force, and had rendered him unable to make any sound. Moreover, it wasn't only one bone spear that was shot. 5 other unfortunate guards were also similarly nailed either to the ground or the walls. In fact, some people's bodies had been pierced by more than one bone spear. And, they had stopped breathing on the spot as a result. The middle-aged security guard gathered his barely remaining trace of strength, and raised his head to see. He hadn't even noticed when a merchant-dressed obese man had appeared not far in the front. He had a short and stout stature. He was slowly walking in the direction of the sparkling gem pavilion's east entrance. This obese man's body was emitting bursts of grey chi. Moreover, 6 luminous dots could be seen behind his head. They were faintly shining. A 6-star magician. Shi Mu wasn't far from the street at the moment. He swept his vision over this short and stout man, and his pupils couldn't help but shrink. This person was one of the fellow young disciples in Lu An's group. Shi Mu hadn't expected that this man would be a star-grade magician in reality. And on top of that, he had also attained the power of 6 stars. Ximen Shui had told him about some of the things related to the star-grade magicians when they were strolling in the rain. A magician could easily trigger a star-like shadow right before stepping into the battle once they had succeeded in building a star palace. In addition, they could also augment the power of their magic arts with the help of this shadow's power. An increase in the number of star-like shadows was directly proportionate to the activation of the star palace's stars. A magician could attain 7 stars at the most. Such magicians were called the 7-star magicians. The fact was that a magician would trigger the star-like shadow because each star-like shadow could enhance the strength of their magic arts by nearly 30% at that time. Furthermore, the might of the magic arts could be enhanced by nearly 3 times if all 7 stars were triggered at the same time. However, this would demand a bountiful consumption of the magician's magic power in return. A star-grade magician could also choose to display star explosion and detonate the star-like virtual shadow at a crucial moment. In fact, a short-time operation of these star-like shadows could substantially enhance the might of one's magic arts. And, this would indirectly reduce his cost of cultivation. Who these people are? The surrounding security guards and Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult's disciples were in a profound shock. However, they drew their weapons, and exhibited a fighting stance. The short and stout man sneered and extended his hand from the black cloak. There was a bone-white wand-like object in his hand. He waved the wand, and the 6 luminous stars behind his head flashed. Then, a few huge magic characters appeared on the ground. The magic characters emitted a strange and vast stretched green fog. Then, the fog completely shrouded the space in the vicinity of the entrance. The security guards and Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult's disciples' complexion became pale. They rushed toward the black-robed obese man. But, they had barely run a few steps, and a few green streaks started to appear on everyone's faces and skin. It seemed like their bodies were covered with lead. Even their actions had become very sluggish. The security guards and Immortal Cult's disciples couldn't reach the obese man. They suddenly fell to the ground in a disorderly manner, and began to throw up foam from their mouth. Even their bodies started to twitch in a crazy manner. The young bodyguard from before had also collapsed to the ground. He was dumbfounded to see that the obese man was continually moving towards them. His eyes were smeared with an unbelievable look. It seemed as if he couldn't believe that someone had dared to attack the sparkling gem pavilion in broad daylight. The short and stout man read an incantation while walking towards them. Then, he raised his hand, and a dozen or more groups of millstone-sized red fireballs emerged out of thin air. Then, they fired into the people who lay on the ground like meteors. Bang! A string of huge explosive sounds rang out in the air. The area in the vicinity of the sparkling gem pavilion's eastern entrance had suddenly changed into a sea of fire. These fiery waves then rolled out and engulfed the guards near the entrance. A dozen or more security guards and Immortal Cult's disciples had been massacred within a few seconds owing to the sudden appearance of that short and stout man. But, the bustling crowd didn't notice the changes that had taken place until the sound of explosion reached their ears. A hubbub of screams and shouting rang out in the air. Then, everyone began to move away from the sparkling gem pavilion and dispersed in all directions. This sparked a chaotic situation for a short while. But, the short and stout man had seemingly not heard these clamorous voices. His body flew over the sea of fire in a very graceful manner. Then, he went inside the sparkling gem pavilion. Meanwhile, at the sparkling gem pavilion's western entrance, a tall black-dressed man strode in the direction of the west entrance. His face was painted red. "Stop! Who is your excellency?" A Taoist swordsman of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult pulled out a long sword from his back with a whistling shua sound. Then, he pointed it at the red-faced man and shouted. The red-painted-faced man showed a fiendish grin. However, he didn't pay attention to the swordsman's action. Then, a red light suddenly spurted out on his body. The sturdy body of the red-faced man seemingly inflated in the red light. It began to swell up at a lightning speed, so much so that his black clothes were torn to shreds. His body became 20-30 feet tall in an instant. Even the original silvery shred color of his face turned ashen in color. And, 2 long fangs protruded from his mouth, like those of a wild beast. A layer of coarse and stiff black hair also sprouted over this man's body. In addition, eagle-like sharp claws emerged from his 5 fingers. The red-faced man had turned into a huge human-form monster in a flash. And, his whole body was curled up in grey smoke. Zombie art. He's the Dark Moon evil cult's follower. The surrounding guards turned pale with fright. They then promptly gathered in the same place. Evildoer, you are courting death. The Taoist priest who carried a long sword on his back shouted loudly, and rushed toward the red-faced man. He flicked his arm, and his shining long sword changed into a several feet long giant sword light. Then, the sword light hacked toward the red-faced zombie man in a fierce manner. The red-faced man continued to move forward. He didn't even pour his glance at the Taoist swordsman. Bang! A muffled sound resounded. The giant sword light pounded on the red-faced man's ashen-colored arm that was densely covered with a layer of coarse black hair. However, it could only leave a shallow trace. In fact, it couldn't even scratch his skin. The Taoist swordsman was greatly startled by this. He wanted to move aside to dodge the zombie man. Bang! A loud sound was heard. The red-faced man brandished his hand in a casual manner, and the Taoist swordsman's body was sent flying backwards. A few deep wounds were split open in his chest, so much so that even his bones could be seen clearly. In fact, his body had nearly been cut into several pieces. Bang! A loud rumbling sound rang out again. The young Taoist swordsman knocked against the wall near the entrance. And, a large area of the wall got smeared with his blood. Then, he rolled to the ground and stopped breathing. The red-faced man grinned in a wicked manner. Then, his huge body charged into the crowd. Afterwards, the surrounding security guards and Immortal Cult's disciples were struck and sent flying. Ordinary sword attacks were like an itching sensation for this man whenever they fell on his body. They couldn't cause any injuries to his body. The security guards and Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult's disciples had fallen in a pool of blood within a few breaths' time. Sparkling Gem Pavilion's southern entrance. A fierce battle between a dozen or more security guards and 2 huge monsters could be seen underway at the moment. One of these 2 beasts was a 30-40 feet long rotten corpse wolf. Its whole body was full of festering carrion. A kind of green and sticky liquid was dropping from its body from time to time. It was emitting a nasty odor that could leave anyone with a desire to puke. The other beast was a gigantic bone tiger. It had very sharp teeth and talons. Its body was relatively smaller than the carcass wolf. But, it was still 20-30 feet long. These 2 beasts were pouncing on and biting at the surrounding people. It seemed as if a wolf had entered into the flock of sheep. Their bodies were quite huge in size. Still, their movements were exceptionally vigorous. The security guards' swords couldn't cause the slightest injuries to these monsters. Instead, these weapons were easily torn to shreds by these monsters. Consequently, the guards and the Immortal Cult's disciples near the entrance were wiped out in a fleeting moment. Only a pile of remnant corpses was left behind on the ground. Then, a short silver-haired young man strode over and went inside the Sparkling Gem Pavilion. He bore a solemn expression on his face while he was walking. His whole body was curled up in a layer of grey smoke. There were 5 silver-colored stars flickering behind his head. A frenzy of screams and panic fleeing continued to ring behind him. Sparkling Gem Pavilion's northern entrance. Bang! A muffled sound was heard. A 70-80 feet long bone python flung its long tail. It pounded a person's silhouette and sent him flying in the air. That silhouette's body snapped into 2 sections in midair, and blood splashed out. Several corpses could be seen scattered over the place in the surrounding. Their clothing was enough to conclude that they were either the corpses of the security guards or Immortal Cult's disciples who had been guarding the Sparkling Gem Pavilion's northern entrance. Some people inside the Sparkling Gem Pavilion were trying to escape from the north exit at this moment. But, their complexion became pale and they stopped as their eyes fell on the massive bone python outside. Suddenly, a tall black-dressed woman walked past the bone python and went straight into the sparkling gem pavilion. Her face was covered with a veil. She held a bone wand in her hand. Surprisingly, there were 7 stars flickering behind her head in an irregular manner. A blood-red moon shadow suddenly appeared in midair inside the auction hall. This was that same hall on the first floor of the sparkling gem pavilion where Shi Mu had been sitting a while ago. Then, the blood-red moon emitted a circle of glaring blood light. The air in the hall also became sticky and hard to breathe in under the effect of the blood light. Many people in the hall were panic-stricken. But, there were some people who had managed to maintain their composure since they considered themselves to be stronger. For example, the participants of the Ascension to Immortality ceremony still maintained a serene expression on the surface. Shentu Guang was seated in the first few rows of the hall. He gazed at the blood moon, and a wisp of unspeakable aghast look floated in his eyes. Shentu Guang had been able to establish the Qi Palace and had stepped into the Xian Tian realm when he was young. Obviously, he made such a feat with the support of his family's resources. He was a little arrogant and mischievous, but he wasn't a straw bag. His martial arts strength was considered quite formidable in the group of some influential family's disciples. Otherwise, he wouldn't be embraced as the leader of those people. However, a feeling of terror and suffocation surged from the bottom of his heart at the moment. Most of the disciples beside him who belonged to several influential families also turned pale with fright. Some of them had even started to tremble. The crowd of people near the first floor hall's exit saw that the situation wasn't good. So, they returned and rushed towards the 4 exits. However, it wasn't long before bursts of disturbances and screams began to erupt outside the 4 exits. A badly mutilated corpse was also thrown inside the 4 exits. It was done to spark an upheaval among the people who wanted to rush out of these exits. The auction hall's stage. Yang Lun's face also revealed an aghast and shocked look as he saw the sudden emergence of the blood mood shadow in midair. Yang Lun was the auctioneer. He didn't get enough time to jump into action. Suddenly, a white light flashed beneath the blood moon, and a person's silhouette emerged out of thin air. It was Luan. He looked very handsome. His red and long hair was fluttering in the air. There was a red, round, and waning moon on his forehead. It was exuding bursts of blood light. It seemed to be conforming to the blood moon shadow in the air. It rendered people with a kind of strange and evil feeling. Luan wore a solemn expression on his face. He mumbled something, and his whole body was shrouded in a layer of faint grey light as a result. Then, a shining full moon's shadow appeared behind his head. After that, a wisp of frightening magic power waves burst out of his body and swept across the entire hall like a gust of wind. A few people were close to Luan. And, their complexion changed very drastically when they saw this scene. There were some weak people in the hall as well. Their eyes rolled back and they fainted on the spot. A full moon magician! Yang Lun exclaimed in alarm. Then, a buzzing sound was heard from the surface of his body, and his whole body exuded a layer of a purple light shield. But, the light shield began to tremble under the impact of the formidable magic power waves as if it was struck heavily. Yang Lun's complexion turned unsightly as he saw this. Chapter 244, The Arrival of Demon King's Era. Translator, Novel Saga Editor. Novel Saga. The distinguished guests in the private room had also noticed that the present situation was far from good. The room was on the 2nd floor of the venue. Hence, they started to rush out of the private room one after another. Princess Yuni was stunned to see Luan's body suspended in midair. His blood-red hair was hanging over his shoulders. It seemed like she couldn't understand the intensity of the present situation. I had a feeling that there is something unusual about this person's identity. But, I had never thought that he would turn out to be a person of the Dark Moon evil cult. In addition, he seems to have attained the peak of the moon grade. In fact, he has ascended to the full moon magician's realm. I'm afraid that there is something fishy about that Shi Mu's identity as well. That dark-skinned experienced man stopped in front of Princess Uni. Then, he said while sweeping his eyes around. His voice had barely fallen when the blood moon's shadow in midair flashed. Then, a beam of red light darted from within, and enveloped the brocade box of the star stone. The box was kept on the high platform in the hall. Then, the small brocade box automatically opened up with a pop sound. And, the star stone floated in the air under the blood light. Ouyang Luan's complexion changed as this happened. He shot his hand in the void, and the purple light around his palm stretched towards the star stone with a buzzing sound. Ping! A stuffy sound echoed. Ouyang Luan's body received a severe jolt in response, so much so that his palm was shaken to fly by this impact. The beam of red light looked weak at a glance. But, it was indestructible in reality. Even Ouyang Luan's earth-grade strength was unable to break through it. Whoosh! The star stone rose very fast under the effect of the red light. It then went inside the virtual shadow of the blood moon. It seemed as if Luan hadn't even bothered to throw a glance at Ouyang Luan. He closed his eyes and unfolded his arms. Then, he mumbled something, and the shadow of the full moon behind his head exuded bright radiance in response. Then, the dark red line on the surface of the star stone started to flicker at an incredibly fast speed. Simultaneously, it started to get dim at equally fast speed. In fact, the speed was so fast that this process was visible to the naked eye. However, the blood moon's shadow was becoming even more solidified. This triggered a violent vibration in the void, and red-colored ripples started to emerge out of thin air. Vibration in the void, a blood-red lightning, then the second, the third. Numerous densely packed blood-red lightning had covered the space over the auction hall in a split second. Then, the chilling wind began to erupt all around. A mass of grey-colored mist gushed out and blended in the ripples near the blood moon's shadow. Then, it began to whirl at an extremely fast speed under the effect of an invisible force. Then, it took the shape of a huge grey-colored whirlwind in midair. This whirlwind was nearly 100 feet in size. The fluctuation in the void was very intense since the entire space was issuing buzzing sounds. Even blurred and vague signs had started to emerge in many places. The grey-colored whirlwind suddenly expanded in all directions. Then, a huge space passage emerged from its middle. Many people in the hall were still in their senses. However, their complexion changed very drastically when they vaguely saw a grey sky through that huge space passage. In addition, 11 round blood moons could also be seen suspended in the sky therein. 10 of them were exceptionally bright, and were emitting blood-red light. Moreover, there was also a huge sacrificial altar below the sky. It was made up of white bones of the dead. A tall and sturdy figure stood on the top of that altar. Its whole body was shrouded in a mass of grey-colored smoke. It took a step and walked towards the door of the space passage. In addition, there was also a large regiment of dead spirit creatures behind that tall silhouette. They were huge in number, to an extent that one couldn't count their number. This isn't good. We have to stop him. He's summoning the dead spirit world's creatures. Ouyang Luan's complexion changed. He turned his hand and pulled out a strange-looking long blade. The imposing aura around his body underwent a sudden change. Then, a magic image's shadow emerged behind him with a flash of purple light. It was a 70 or 80 feet long huge blade shadow. Its whole body was wrapped in a layer of purple light. Then, he grasped his blade with his hands, and hacked it into the void towards Luan. The long blade shadow exuded bright rays of light in his background. Then, it similarly hacked towards Luan and the space passage. Suddenly, a gigantic 100 feet long purple blade light emerged along with incomparably thick smoke. It then hacked down at an incredible speed. In this meantime, 50 or more people had already pounced towards Luan from various places in the hall. Most of these people were young, and they looked like they were below the 30-year mark. They ought to be the talented disciples of their respective sects who had converged here to attend the Ascension to Immortality ceremony. These people hadn't arrived yet, but a rain of real chi condensed blade light, sword shadows, fireballs, and ice spears had been shot towards Luan from all directions. They carried an astonishing imposing aura. Luan mumbled something while being in the air. Then, the 10 of his fingers began to make various pinching gestures at a very fast speed. The full moon behind his body suddenly exuded glorious light. Then, a green light flashed, and 100 or more door-sized green wind blades emerged out of thin air in front of his body. They started to spin around, and covered almost small half of the sky in the process. Then, a chi-chi sound resounded in the hall as Luan raised his arm. The wind blades bombarded the next moment, and sent people flying in all directions. Simultaneously, another vast stretched green wind blade emerged out his whole body. Bang! The huge purple blade light arrived first, and hacked at the dozens of wind blades in a fierce manner. But, the blade light collapsed and faded away upon the impact. It was followed by various blade lights, sword shadows and magic techniques. But, they all got dispersed in the vast stretched green wind blade in a split second. Ouyang Luan thundered loudly, and the long blade magic image behind his body flashed. It then appeared in front of his body in a horizontal manner. Ping ping, a series of rumbling sound rang out. These green wind blades bombarded on the long blade magic image several times in a row. This led to an eruption of green light and purple light masses. And Ouyang Luan was sent flying dozens of feet backwards by its impact. However, Ouyang Luan's magic image still remained extremely firm. It did reveal a fit of tremor for a while, but it managed to withstand the impact. However, the people who had courageously stepped forward ended up being very unfortunate. And why wouldn't they be? After all, they hadn't seen such a powerful magic art in their entire lives. The speed of these green wind blades was excessively fast, so much so that it was practically impossible to dodge it in such a short time. Ah! The rain of the green wind blades merely took a fleeting second to chop down more than 20 people into fragments. In fact, the body protecting real chi and all kinds of defensive magic tools had seemed no better than a paper stick in front of the wind blades. A series of pitiful screams was heard. Some people had luckily evaded the first wave of attack. However, they received the same fate when they confronted the second wave of a sudden downpour of the wind blades. The widespread nasty wind and rain of blood splattered down on the people below. Everyone in the hall was already in a thunderstruck state ever since they had seen Luan's intrepid magic arts. In fact, their eyes were filled with overwhelming fear. They then suddenly felt that blood and meat as it fell on them. Master Fei, you don't need to worry about me. You go and help the others. Princess Uni sucked in a long breath. However, her complexion barely resumed its normal state. Then, she addressed the dark-skinned experienced man who stood in front of her like a shield. A 1-foot-long exquisite short stick appeared in her hand the next moment. Then, she read an incantation and a layer of silver light shield bubbled up on her body. It covered the people who stood around her as well, the experienced man, her other escorts, and the 2 young maids. Princess, my duty is to ensure your safety. I can't look after the life and death of other people, the experienced man replied while breaking his silence. Princess Uni was about to say something. Suddenly, a change occurred in the space passage and it started to fluctuate. A tall and sturdy silhouette walked out from the space passage. Its whole body was curled up in the grey smoke. It was a huge monster which was more than 100 feet in height. This monster was an ox-headed person. His body was covered with a layer of short black hair. He had a dark and smooth skin. Moreover, there wasn't a filthy aura around him like that of the dead spirit creatures. In addition, there were 2 crescent moon-shaped cow horns on top of this monster's head. His eyes were bloodshot. He held a huge bone axe in his hand. In fact, the bone axe was almost as long as his height. The surface of the axe was filled with a circle of abstruse and profound spirit pattern and magic characters. It was emanating a very terrorizing aura that could make anyone tremble. In fact, this aura was far more formidable than that Luan's dreadful aura. Luo. Demon King Luo Tian. Ouyang Luan stood at the edge of the auction stage. He saw the ox-headed monster and was shocked for a moment as a result. The experienced man stood beside Princess Yuni at the moment. His complexion also changed for the worse as he saw this scene. He couldn't afford to think about the rest of the guards and maidservants at this time. So, he grasped and pulled Princess Yuni towards an exit in order to escape. Respected Demon King Luotian, the pious Dark Moon's follower welcomes you to grace us with your presence. Luan's complexion looked faintly pale at this moment. He bowed and greeted the ox-headed monster with deep veneration. Human boy, how are you related with that mixed-haired old man Dongfang Xiantian? Demon King Luotian glanced at Luan and asked, his voice seemed like a rumbling thunder. Dongfang Xiantian is my master, Luan replied in a respectful manner. But, he had made a standard contract with me in the past. So, you will have to offer me a sacrifice of thousands of people every time I'll be summoned, Demon King Luotian stated. Respected Demon King, this is the capital city of the Lu Shan Kingdom. So, there are millions of people who can be offered as sacrifice. I am offering them to you. Please enjoy as much as you like. Luan said. Great. Millions of people. Demon King Luotian heard his words, and his eyes radiated with a magnificent red light. His huge ox eyeballs glanced around, and he abruptly exuded a huge mass of grey light. Then, he raised his right foot and stomped on the ground in a violent manner. Bang! A loud ear-piercing rumbling sound was heard. The venue's ground suddenly plunged down. A vast stretched mass of grey light gushed out from Demon King Luotian's body. It seemed like the waves of water as it spread toward the surrounding. The hard ground seemingly turned into mud, and formed a circle of waves and ripples. These shockwaves seemed like a sea tide. And, they had enveloped the entire auction hall in a flash. The entire hall was razed to the ground in an instant. The surrounding people tumbled to the ground as if they were a log of wood. There were many people who were below the Xiantian level. Those people started to bleed profusely from every opening in their body. Then, they died on the spot. Some people were relatively closer to Demon King Luotian. Their bodies received such a severe shockwave that they immediately turned into a lump of meat mud. People who were at Xiantian level or higher barely withstood this shockwave. But, such powerful impacts still made them spout a mouthful of blood. Then, most of them lost their consciousness. The Demon King Luotian raised the arm which didn't hold the axe, and the layer of dense grey smoke around his whole body dispersed in all directions. Then, it rolled up these surrounding corpses. Those corpses were swept away by the grey smoke. Then, these corpses began to fly high and exploded one after another. Then, they changed into the blood fog, and converged toward the top of the head of the Demon King. Then, they started to spin at an extremely high speed, and turned into a ball of red fog. Demon King Luotian opened his mouth wide, and the red fog ball flew into his mouth. Happy, happy. I haven't tasted such a fresh blood meal for a long time. Demon King Luotian issued a deafening laughter. However, his deafening laughter stopped the next moment. The fact was that there were still two people in the hall who hadn't lost their ability to act. And, they were currently fleeing in the direction of the two exits. One of these two people was the chief guest of the Heavenly Wu Chamber of Commerce Elder Ouyang Luan. And, the other was that experienced escort of Princess Yuni's. He was escaping while carrying Princess Yuni in his arms since she had also lost her consciousness. It seemed that these two men were outstanding Earth-grade warriors. These two had barely resisted the impact of Demon King Luotian's attack. But, their exhausted expression was sufficient to conclude that they were apparently in a very poor condition. The Demon King Luotian bellowed loudly, and the huge axe in his hand emitted magnificent grey light. He then waved his axe, and two huge grey axe-edged shadows appeared while carrying an inexhaustible force. Then, they darted in two separate directions, and caught up with those two people in an instant. The speed of these attacks made it seem like they had been teleported to their prey. Ouyang Luan's face revealed a desperate look. He bellowed and whirled around. His body radiated a purple light, and it condensed into a huge purple blade magic image in front of him. The long blade in his hand shone brightly, and he hacked it towards the approaching grey axe-edge shadow head-on. Ka-cha! The purple light blade magic image who was guarding his body collapsed and dispersed with a loud rumble. In addition, the long blade in his hand also snapped into two pieces in a very clean manner. Ouyang Lun's facial expression froze. Suddenly, a bloodstain emerged on his body from head to crotch. He then split in two halves with splashes of blood. Ouyang Lun was severed into two sections by the grey axe edge. After that, he staggered and collapsed to the ground with a force so huge that it ploughed out a long ditch in the ground. 100 or more unconscious people who lay on the ground were also meted the same fate as him. They were erased along with their bones. Shentu Guang and his scoundrel companions who were seated in the front few rows were no exception either. And, they were wiped out in a similar manner. It could be said that these people had a terribly bad luck today. Chapter 245, Offering Sacrifices. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. The other grey axe-edge shadow also caught up with Princess Yuni's escort. He had nearly fled to the door by now. This escort was the same experienced man from before. The experienced man's complexion changed as he noticed this. He turned his hand and took out a white magic charm. He then pinched it with his fingers and crushed it into pieces. A mass of dazzling white luminescence enveloped him and Princess Yuni the next moment. But, the grey-edge shadow had also arrived close to them by this time. It then hacked at the white light. Blood splattered and a muffled groan spread from the white light. The white radiance suddenly brightened, and then dissipated. Meanwhile, an arm fell from midair. But, Princess Yuni and her escort had disappeared from the sight by now. The space passage behind the Demon King Luotian shook, and a burst of rumbling sound was transmitted. A team of dead spirit creatures were outdoing one another in order to rush out from it first. All kinds of monster corpses, zombies, and a large number of human skeletons were present in their ranks. They held various kinds of weapons. Hundreds of grotesquely shaped dead spirit creatures burst into the auction hall in an instant. However, they were still followed by the dead spirit army that still wanted to squeeze out through the space passage. Only a handful of Xiantian warriors were still alive in the hall at the moment. But, most of them were in an unconscious state. These dead spirit creatures seemed to be quite sensitive to the opposite party's qi. So, they scattered in all directions as soon as they appeared in the hall. They then began to slaughter those people who didn't have counter-resisting strength at the moment. The entire auction hall was reduced to a bloody slaughterhouse for a moment. The pungent smell of blood as if soared into the sky. And, such a nasty smell could make anyone want to vomit. Luan was still under the blood moon's shadow. The trace of a frenzied look flashed through his eyes as he watched everything that was happening below. He glanced at the Demon King Luotian below, and his pale white big sleeves shook. Then, a mass of blood flame billowed out from the solace of his feet. It then carried his body to the side of an exit. The Demon King Luotian issued a loud roar in excitement. His huge copper bell-like eyes swept around once. Then, he took a big step and strode over to the hall's wall. After that, he brandished his huge axe, and the fiery grey axe-edge shadow flew out at a particular angle. Bang! The axe-edge arrived and the solid wall collapsed with a loud crashing sound even though it had been further strengthened by a certain spell. In fact, a big hole had been split open in the wall by this strike. The Demon King Luotian stepped out of the hall amidst the rolling smoke and dust. In fact, this scenery made it seem as if the creator of the universe had unleashed the primal chaos once again. There were still many people in the vicinity of the sparkling gem pavilion's street. They hadn't returned yet since they wanted to stay and watch the situation. However, their eyes suddenly fell on the gigantic silhouette of the Demon King Luotian at this time. They then felt the vicious and dreadful murderous aura that his body was exuding. Could they still continue to stay here any further? They issued panicked screams, and dispersed in all directions to escape. Tiny insects, consider yourself dead. The Demon King Luo Tian burst into a wild laughter. The circle of magic characters on the surface of his huge bone axe lit up. Then, they started to flutter, and changed into a fuzzy grey light. Then, the grey axe shadow whistled out from above, and flew out in all directions. The space started to turn fuzzy from distortion wherever the axe shadow visited. The surrounding buildings began to crumble to the ground like a paper stick as soon as they came in contact with the axe shadow. Layers of smoke and dust started to spring up in the area. Then, the Demon King Luo Tian raised his foot and stomped heavily on the ground. Bang! Circles of ripples began to spread towards the surroundings, just like it had happened in the auction hall. Everything collapsed and shattered into pieces within a radius of hundreds of feet. The surrounding area had turned into a land of ruins in a fraction of a second. It was hard to determine how many people had been buried underneath since they hadn't got enough time to escape this calamity. Then, the mass of grey smoke rolled out again, and then corpses began to explode one after another. They once again condensed into a huge mass of blood-red fog ball. Then, they were swallowed by the Demon King Luo Tian. Happy, happy, the Demon King issued a loud and long roar out of excitement. There was a street quite far from the sparkling gem pavilion where the Demon King stood at present. So, it was still unaffected by this outburst. On top of a certain building there, a golden gleam flashed in Shi Mu's eyes. Then, he looked at the Demon King from afar, and his brows slightly creased as a result. Cai stood on his shoulder and his whole body was trembling at the moment. He covered his head with his wings, and revealed only one eye to watch on. The fact was that he was extremely frightened to see the gigantic body of the Demon King Luo Tian. Shi Tou, let's run! Shi Mu's eyes flashed and he retracted his gaze from the Demon King's body. Then, he refocused his gaze in the direction of the Western City District where Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult's branch cult was located. It seemed that he wasn't in a hurry to leave. Luan, the masked woman, and other people of their team stood against the wind on the sparkling gem pavilion's roof. A strange and frantic gleam appeared in their eyes when they watched the purgatory-like chaotic scene in the city. Master, thousands of people would be buried in your memory. Please rest in peace. Luan's long and red hair was fluttering in the wind. His facial expression looked respectful as he spoke up while looking up at the heavens. The other four also made the same action. Several bright lights emerged in the western part of the heavenly U-City at this moment. They then started to rush in this direction. Big brother, they are the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult's people, the masked woman stood up and said. Elder Taoist Wu Chen can't sit back and watch. I leave this place to you in accordance with our original plan. Luan nodded. Then, he turned around and addressed his companions. After that, he pointed his foot on the ground, and a spurt of blood flame gushed out. It supported his body, and he flew down to where the Demon King Luo Tian was standing. The trace of a complicated look flashed through masked woman's eyes as she watched Luan fly away. Let's get started. She took a deep breath, and her facial expression returned to normal. Then, she commanded to the other three people. The other three people nodded. Then, all four of them jumped down the roof, and went into the auction hall. The dead spirit creatures were still bursting into the hall through the space passage in an endless stream. There wasn't a single person alive in the venue at the moment. Therefore, these bloodthirsty dead spirit creatures had started to swarm towards the four exits. Some of them even started to rush out through the big hole that had been split open by the Demon King Luo Tian. The masked woman and other three people turned a blind eye to their activities. The masked woman and her companions cast a spell to summon a number of human skeletons. Then, these skeletons were ordered to gather the scattered corpses in the corner of the hall. Thousands of corpses were soon piled up in one place of the hall. This led to the formation of a tall mountain of corpses. After that, these four people stood in four different corners of the corpse mountain. Then, their facial expression turned solemn and they started to read an incantation. 4 bright red tokens appeared in front of these 4 people with a flash of blood light. After that, these 4 people exuded a huge mass of grey-colored light that grew increasingly brighter. Then, these lights converged at a point, and formed a huge grey-colored magic circle. The magic circle had covered the corpses inside it. The masked woman then waved her hands while reading an incantation. A few grey magic characters fled from her hand and submerged in the red token she held. The other 3 people also did the same action. Suddenly, that mountain of corpses flared up with a hoo-hoo sound inside the magic circle. It seemed as if these corpses were being cremated in the blood-red flames. They then started to vanish into thin air. In the dead spirit world, billowing black clouds were floating over the summit of a huge bone-made sacrificial altar. Suddenly, a couple of black lightning vaguely appeared amid the black clouds. 8 thick bones of the dead stood upright on the summit of that sacrificial altar. Those bones suddenly radiated a grey luminescence. This light then condensed into a grey magic circle. Then, the grey magic circle started to revolve while issuing buzzing sound. Simultaneously, corpses began to appear out of thin air from time to time. The surrounding grey smoke would converge in a crazy manner as the corpses would fall on the altar. Then, the smoke would drill into the corpse. Consequently, these corpses would start to wither at an alarming speed. Then, they'd change into a skinny frame of bones. These corpses' hands and feet would tremble after some time had passed. Then, they would stagger up. In the sparkling gem pavilion, the corpses kept disappearing under the spell of the grey magic circle. Simultaneously, a plume of grey smoke appeared from the blood-red tokens and submerged in the masked woman and other 3 people's top of the head. They were like long whales who were absorbing water in the form of this grey smoke. The grey radiance around these 4 people started to grow brighter as a result. Also, the imposing aura around their bodies started to become more and more formidable. Simultaneously, the grey magic circle became increasingly brighter, and the blazing red flames became more and more exuberant. And more corpses started to disappear from the magic circle as a result. Thousands of corpses had disappeared from the magic circle within a few minutes. Afterwards, the grey magic circle dissipated in a slow manner. The masked woman and other 3 people were emitting magnificent grey radiance at the moment. Even the aura around their bodies seemed significantly stronger than before. The masked woman was originally at the peak of the star-grade magician's realm. But, now it seemed that she might make a breakthrough to the moon grade pretty soon. The red-faced man looked very excited. It seemed that he was about to speak something. Suddenly, a loud earth-shattering explosive sound was heard outside the sparkling gem pavilion. It was accompanied by intermittent bursts of the Demon King's furious roars. The masked woman's complexion changed. Then, the sparkling gem pavilion quivered in a violent manner, and a wall collapsed with a loud rumble. This formed a big hole there. Then, 3 person silhouettes flashed through the hole. The masked woman immediately got up and turned around to see in that direction. She saw that 3 people had flushed in. They were clad in Taoist robes. They were emitting a dazzling white radiance. These people were the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult's Earth-grade elders. The 3 elders looked towards the center of the hall and swooped towards the space passage. A bright grey light suddenly shone in the void in front of the space passage. Then, a massive golden human skeleton appeared. It swept its golden spear and streaked a golden rainbow in midair. Then, the rainbow collided with the 3 elders. Bang! A loud explosive sound rang out. The huge body of the golden skeleton drew a step back by its impact. But, the 3 Earth-grade elders of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult were struck and sent flying. The 3 elders flew for a short distance before they came to a stop. But, it seemed that they hadn't received any injury. Instead, an even brighter white radiance had appeared on their bodies. The Golden Skeleton King, a middle-aged man, exclaimed in a startled manner. His voice had barely faded when a black light flashed in front of the space passage. Then, 2 huge dead spirit creatures emerged. One of them was a gigantic 70-80 feet tall green-haired zombie. And, the other was a double-headed rotten corpse of a wolf. Both of them were exuding a very formidable aura. In fact, their auras were almost equivalent to the Golden Skeleton King's. The fact was that these two were also Earth-grade monsters. The masked woman and other three people's stature flashed a few times as they positioned themselves in front of the space passage to block the way. The three elders' complexions sank. Suddenly, those three Earth-grade dead spirit creatures bellowed and pounced towards the three elders. These monsters didn't even give them enough time to react. It seemed that these three elders had no other choice now. Hence, each exuded a bright white light. Then, each condensed it into a huge magic image. Then, they jumped into a fierce battle with the three dead spirit creatures. The battle between these 6 Earth-grade powerhouses had started. Rays of light would often fall either on the ground or on the wall from midair. And, this would give rise to loud rumbling sounds. A thick sword light bombarded on one of the side walls. The sparkling gem pavilion was already badly wrecked. So, it received a burst of violent shaking by the impact of this strike. However, it couldn't withstand and crashed with a loud sound as a result. The masked woman and her other 3 companions exuded a large mass of grey light. Then, the light converged and condensed into a huge grey light shield over the space passage. The shield was placed there to block the falling rocks. The red-faced man also transformed into the black-haired zombie and started to brandish his sturdy hand. His hand would hit and crush the falling rocks into pieces. However, those 6 Earth-grade powerhouses didn't the least pay attention to these tumbling rocks. And, they continued on with their fierce battle. But, many surrounding dead spirit creatures were getting buried underneath these falling rocks. The 8-story-high sparkling gem pavilion finally toppled over with a loud crashing sound. The surrounding became bright and spacious. The masked woman and her companions could clearly see the outside situation now. At least thousands of dead spirit creatures had already descended and dispersed throughout the Heavenly U City prior to this devastation. Moreover, a dozen or more streets near the sparkling gem pavilion had already been slaughtered by these dead spirit creatures. But, the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult and the Lu Shan Kingdom forthwith jumped into action. A large number of soldiers and Immortal Cult's disciples had converged from all directions, and had started a hand-to-hand fight with these creatures. This incident had thrown the entire city into chaos and endless slaughters. Chapter 246, Power of the Magic Weapons. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Bang! A loud rumbling sound was heard. In fact, it was so loud that it could almost perforate a person's eardrums. In addition, a howling gust of wind also burst out along with this loud explosive sound. The wind was permeated with 2 colored rays of light black and white. Such huge impact also rendered a powerful jolt to the masked woman and the other 3 people. Many ruins of the sparkling gem pavilion were also blown out to fly. These 4 people were startled. They immediately looked in the direction of the loud explosion. They saw that a large area over the ruins was permeated with a mass of grey fog. In addition, the Demon King Luo Tian's huge body could be seen engaged in an intense fight with a white-haired old man. This old man was the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult's head elder Taoist Wu Chen. Elder Taoist Wu Chen's face looked dignified at the moment. A washbasin-sized ancient white seal had been fluttering in the air beside him. However, it underwent a small change. On the other side, the huge axe in the Demon King Luo Tian's hand started to shake in a violent manner. It then began to issue bursts of thunderous rumbling sound. Each collision of their weapons set off a massive wave of vitality along with strange lights that shot up to the sky. The surrounding space seemed to be flooded with bursts of water like ripples. And, those ripples were intertwined with grey-colored fog. This made the 2 silhouettes appear a bit fuzzy. Shi Mu stood on the roof of a 5-story garret that was located far from these 2 silhouettes. The golden gleam was flickering in his eyes, and his shining eyes were constantly gazing in the direction of the sparkling gem pavilion's ruins. He had found a panoramic view of everything in the vicinity of the sparkling gem pavilion from this height. His eyes were stuck on the battle between Elder Taoist Wu Chen and Demon King Luo Tian. The heaven rank was considered the top existence of the entire continent. So, it was obviously a fortuitous opportunity to come across a legendary battle between two heaven-ranked powerhouses. Shi Tou. Let's go, what's so good about this battle? Cai stuck out his hairy head from Shi Mu's jacket and muttered. Shut up! Shi Mu stretched out his hand and interrupted Cai's words. Cai glanced at Shi Mu in a somewhat complaining manner. But then, a huge magic power shockwave suddenly transmitted from the sparkling gem pavilion's direction. Cai was frightened by this, and he immediately retracted his head inside Shi Mu's clothing with a whiz sound. The battle between Elder Taoist Wu Chen and the Demon King grew even more intense near the sparkling gem pavilion. Wu Chen's ancient white seal hadn't fallen into a disadvantageous position even once. Instead, it had gradually gained the upper hand in this battle. It would often shoot a sparkling white light that would force the Demon King Luo Tian to retreat. This had been infuriating the Demon King, and had left him to issue roars again and again. It was evident that Elder Taoist Wu Chen had eventually grabbed the upper hand in this battle. However, it didn't seem that he could overshadow the Demon King anytime soon. Another group was also tangled in a fierce battle not far from these two. A burst of light flashed and collided in a fierce manner like a meteor streaking across the sky. It also issued a shrill and ear-piercing whistling sound. Then, the light scattered toward the surrounding area. A few people's silhouettes could be vaguely seen moving speedily amidst these rays of light. They were almost flickering like a ghost. The aftermath of this fierce battle fell on the ground, and blew up a big pit in the nearby ground. Layers of dust and smoke rose upwards and fluttered in the air as a result. The scope of this battle was a lot smaller than the Demon King and Elder Taoist Wu Chen's fighting range. However, the degree of this battle's intensity was only a little inferior to theirs. Bang! A loud sound rang out. The fierce battle between the two sides abruptly stopped with a loud collision. Then, both parties bounced back and steadied themselves. This sudden halt finally revealed the appearances of the four silhouettes that were confronting each other in the distance. One battling party was Luan. And, the other party consisted of 3 people. These 3 people had an equally breathtaking aura around them. One of these people wore the sky blue Taoist robe of the transcending heaven immortal cult. And, the other 2 people were dressed in a bright yellow robe. The national emblem of the Lu Shan kingdom could be seen inscribed on their robes. The fact was that these 2 were the earth-ranked consecrates of the Lu Shan kingdom. Each of these 3 people released their respective martial arts magic images at this moment. And, their magic images emitted a bright radiance. Luan's body also emitted a splendid grey radiance. Then, a shining full moon shadow emerged behind his head and started to emit luminous brilliance. Luan held a grey-colored sword in his hand, but plenty of gaps could be seen on the surface of his blade. It seemed like it was quite old and simple. However, the sword's sharp edge was emanating a misty grey sword chi in a constant manner. However, the complexion of these 4 people looked pale, and they were gasping for breath at the moment. Luan had been single-handedly fighting against these 3 Earth-grade powerhouses. Even so, he didn't seem to be in an unfavorable situation. Suddenly, a loud rumbling sound was heard from the side. It was followed by an infuriated and painful roar of the Demon King Luo Tian. Luan's complexion slightly changed. He turned around to look in that direction. The Demon King Luo Tian's massive body drew a few steps back in quick succession. Then, his stature staggered since a huge wound was split open in his chest. The wound was so deep that even his bone could be seen clearly. However, he wasn't bleeding. His eyes blazed with an infuriated look as he glowered at Elder Taoist Wu Chen who stood not far from him. The fact was that a small half of his huge bone axe had been paired off by Wu Chen's attack. Consequently, the grey light his axe was emitting had dimmed very significantly. An ancient wooden sword suddenly appeared in Elder Taoist Wu Chen's hand. The sword's edge seemed to be exuding heavenly green radiance. A few green-colored magic characters could be seen flickering amid the green light from time to time. These characters looked very mysterious. Another magic weapon. The corner of Luan's eyes twitched slightly. Spirit tools were considered more formidable than magic tools. And the legendary magic weapons were regarded more formidable than the spirit tools. In fact, the indescribable might of the magic weapons was far beyond the spirit tools. However, the magic weapons were extremely scarce. The Demon King Luotian's huge bone axe obviously commanded enormous might. But, it was only equivalent to a top-grade spirit tool. Elder Taoist Wu Chen either relied on the white ancient seal or the old wooden sword to confront the Demon King. But, both of his weapons were surprisingly magic weapons. An idea cropped up in Luan's mind, and he began to think of retreating. He had already achieved the goal of his trip. He hadn't only massacred many talented disciples who had converged here to attend the Ascension to Immortality auction, but he had also pushed the entire Heavenly U City into an extremely tumultuous situation. In fact, countless ruins of buildings and walls could be seen across the city. However, the true powerhouses of the transcending heaven immortal cult would soon rush over if they didn't retreat at this very moment. Besides, he also knew that not a single person of the Dark Moon cult would be able to leave this place once those experts had arrived. Elder Taoist Wu Chen swept his vision towards the sparkling gem pavilion. A steady stream of dead spirit creature was still gushing out of the space passage. In addition, the 3 Earth-grade elders seemed to be tied down by the 3 Earth-grade dead spirit creatures. These elders didn't seem capable of scoring a victory anytime soon. Therefore, it was needless to mention the prospect of them destroying the space passage. Wu Chen's face revealed an anxious look. He snorted in a cold manner, and started to count on his fingers. The ancient white seal that was fluttering in the air beside him exuded dazzling rays of light. Then, it spun around and became as big as the size of a house. This had happened in a flash. Then, it dashed towards the Demon King Luotian like a meteor. The ancient wooden sword in Wu Chen's hand emanated bright green radiance as this happened. Then, he wielded his sword high in the sky, and a huge crescent moon-shaped light blade whistled out. The light blade darted forward while trailing a fluctuation in the space behind. Then, it hacked towards the Demon King's chest at an incomparably fast speed. The trace of a petrified look flashed through the Demon King's eyes as he saw this. He bellowed loudly and held the huge axe with his both hands. Then, a thick layer of grey fog bubbled up and shrouded his whole body. It was so thick that it seemed as if it was made up of a substance. It had been congealed to ward off the attack. Then, Wu Chen gently flicked the white horsetail whisk he had just brought out. A white light emerged on the horsetail whisk, and it changed into a heap of white silk. The white silks blotted out the sky as it caught up with the crescent moon-shaped light blade. Then, it wound around the massive body of the Demon King Luotian before the arrival of the white seal. Another magic weapon. Luan's complexion changed once again, and his hesitations vanished. The full moon's shadow behind his head shone with dazzling rays of light. Then, the widespread 5-colored rays of light emerged in front of his body and darted towards the 3 Earth-grade powerhouses who stood in front of him. Every beam of light was one of the 5 mighty elements of magic arts. They gathered together and rushed towards the 3 people. It seemed as if the mighty sea was rushing towards them. The 3 Earth-grade people were alarmed by this. And, they hurriedly shot their magic image to resist the attack. Luan turned around after he had launched his attack. He then took the form of a red fleeing light as he fled in the direction of the collapsed sparkling gem pavilion. The Demon King Luotian bellowed as he struggled to unshackle himself. However, the white silks that had wrapped around his body tightened its grip even further. These white silks were very tenacious, so much so that even the enormous strength of the Demon King couldn't shake them off him. The Demon King's complexion changed. A jet-black magic character emerged on the surface of his body. Then, a burst of caw-caw sound spread from within his body, and his gigantic body suddenly shrunk. His body turned several times smaller than its original height. In fact, he was now barely 2 or 3 feet in height. Bang! The ancient white seal rubbed past his body and smashed on the ground. and a huge and dark pit was blasted open in the ground with a loud explosive sound as a result. This pit was at least 20 or 30 feet deep. The Demon King Luo Tian had luckily evaded the white seal. However, he couldn't evade the following attack properly. It was the sword light. Consequently, one of his arms was chopped down by the sword light. The Demon King issued a miserable groan in pain. Suddenly, his body exuded a black radiance, and he took advantage of the opportunity since the grip of white silk was still loosened. His stature flashed and appeared in the vicinity. The Demon King was extremely sturdy and valiant. But, he didn't dare to continue to confront Wu Chen and his endless waves of magic weapons anymore. A mass of black smoke bubbled up on the Demon King's body and enveloped his whole body. Now, his only intention was to quickly integrate into the void and return to the dead spirit world. Evil monster, where would you escape to? Elder Taoist Wu Chen's thunderous voice resounded, and his stature chased after him the next moment. Meanwhile, his white seal suddenly shot up into the sky. Wu Chen's plan was to pursue and catch up with the Demon King first. Buzz! The white seal shone magnificently and exuded circles of white ripples. After that, these white ripples enveloped the Demon King Luo Tian completely. The Demon King was profoundly shocked. The surrounding air immediately became thick and heavy. In addition, the surrounding space seemed to have frozen since he was unable to return to the other world. A huge mass of misty grey smoke started to gush out of his body in a crazy manner in this moment of desperation. Then, the smoke wrapped his whole body, and desperately tried to resist the white ripples in the surrounding void. The solidification of the space wasn't exceptionally firm. In fact, it could be broken with ease by the Demon King if he exerted his strength for some time. However, the Demon King's movement was strangled at this point of time. Elder Taoist Wu Chen arrived close to him very quickly, but his face revealed an exhausted look. The ancient wooden sword in his hand released a magnificent green light, and his sword turned into a huge green-colored wooden sword the next moment. In fact, it was almost 100 or more feet in size now. Then, the sword hacked towards the Demon King in a relentless manner while carrying an inexhaustible imposing aura. The Demon King Luo Tian's eyes seemed as if they wanted to pop out of his eye sockets. He couldn't make the slightest crack in the frozen void. So, his body exuded a huge mass of black light instead. Then, the light condensed into a garret-like gigantic ox shadow, and made a shield in front his body. However, the shadow was easily ripped apart by the green wooden sword shadow. Ka-cha! The Demon King Luo Tian's body was conveniently slashed into two halves. And, the two gigantic sections of his body topped over with a loud thud. But then, a mass of black smoke suddenly flew out from the remnant body of the Demon King. A very small silhouette could be vaguely seen amid that smoke. It then shot a glaring look at Wu Chen in a resentful manner. Then, the black smoke flashed and integrated into the void. And subsequently, it disappeared without a trace. Unfortunately, I couldn't exterminate this fierce monster. Elder Taoist Wu Chen muttered. Then, he turned his hand and shot a beam of green light. Then, the huge green-colored wooden sword flashed and shrunk back to its original size at a lightning speed. After that, it flew back to his hands. Wu Chen's complexion looked deathly white with exhaustion. He had deployed a plethora of magic weapons back-to-back during this battle. So, it would have obviously consumed an enormous amount of his strength. However, he sucked in a deep breath. Then, his stature flashed and turned into a white light as he shot towards the sparkling gem pavilion's ruins like an electric current. Meanwhile, the blood-red fleeing light flew into the ruins of sparkling gem pavilion. Then, the blood light converged, and Lu An's silhouette came into appearance. "Get ready to withdraw," he ordered the masked woman and the other people in a loud voice. Then, he waved his hand and a streak of black light submerged into the space passage that was under the blood moon's shadow. After that, the space passage trembled and started to close in a slow manner. Luan waved his hand, and a brick-sized black-colored magic charm appeared in his hand. Then, he pinched it and broke it into pieces. Innumerable and massive black magic characters began to appear out of thin air in the open space beside him as a result. They whirled and danced in the air for a moment. Then, they took the form of a black magic array. This array was hexagonal in shape. Then, a circle of abstruse spirit pattern flickered on the surface of the array. And, it started to emit a strong space fluctuation. Chapter 247, Sacrifices and Escapes. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Far in the battlefield, the masked women and the other three people looked into each other's eyes. Would they still dare to have the slightest hesitation? They quickly flew in the direction of the magic circle. "Evildoer, you can't run away!" A thunderously loud and furious voice was heard. It was followed by a white light that flashed over. It was the ancient white seal. However, a huge abstruse magic character could be seen beneath the white seal this time. The white ripples proliferated and covered the entire area of the sparkling gem pavilion's ruins. Luan's complexion changed very drastically. The surrounding air under the scope of this white light had become incomparably viscous. In addition, the operation of the black magic circle had also slowly stopped by its impact. Elder Taoist Wu Chen's strength had far surpassed his expectation. The fact was that Wu Chen was a heaven-ranked powerhouse, and his invincible strength was formidable enough to slaughter the Demon King Luotian very conveniently. Therefore, the possibility of these five people's survival was slim to none if they couldn't succeed in getting teleported right away. "I offer my blood as a sacrifice to our Dark Lord." Luan whirled around as these words fell into his ears. He saw that the masked woman's stature soared high up in the sky. Then, she turned in midair and flew towards the white seal. A grey-colored blazing flame bubbled up on the surface of her body. The 7 luminous star shadows behind her head radiated magnificent brilliance. Then, one of them exploded with a loud rumbling sound. Then the second, the third. This woman had detonated the power of all 7 stars at the same time. The masked woman's body began to exude an increased number of magic power waves as the wisps of the grey fog integrated into her body one after another. In fact, it was several times more than before. "Sister Yao, what are you doing? Stop at once!" Luan exclaimed. The masked woman turned around and shot a profound look at Luan. Then, the corner of her mouth smeared with a touch of a smile. After that, the grey bone wand she held exuded splendid black radiance. Then, an extremely thick grey light beam galloped from inside and bombarded on the white seal in a fierce manner. The huge white seal received a sudden jolt. Simultaneously, the white ripples that it was emanating also revealed a burst of tremor. However, it didn't disappear. "We will defend our dignity in the name of our Dark Lord. We will obtain the eternal life in the endless darkness." The silver-haired young man and the short and stout man also followed the masked woman. They also started to detonate the star shadows behind their heads. The grey-colored blazing flames also appeared on their bodies in a similar manner. After that, another 2 grey light beams rose high up. They then simultaneously plummeted down on the huge white seal. The ancient white seal trembled in a violent manner. And, the white ripples seemed as if they were on the verge of collapse. Suddenly, a grey-colored silhouette appeared in front of the white seal. Its whole body was covered with a layer of black hair. This silhouette turned out to be the red-painted-faced man. His hands curled into a fist hammer, and he pounded them towards the white seal. The surrounding void issued exploding sounds as the fist wind passed. Bang! The radiance on the surface of the white seal flashed, and the seal started to tremble in a violent manner. Consequently, the white ripples disintegrated and disappeared. However, the red-faced man also experienced a powerful jolt from the counter-shaking power of white seal magic weapon. He was sent flying backwards like a worn-out sack as a result. The aura around his body also subsided and became a lot weaker in a fleeting moment. The masked woman and the other 2 people's bodies were also shaken this time. They staggered and fell to the ground in a weak manner. The white ripples that had pervaded the surrounding space finally faded away. Luan's black magic circle returned to its normal state at the same time. Then, a mass of black light rolled out from the circle without further ado. It then enveloped Luan's body. Then, the light again flashed and disappeared without a trace. Elder Taoist Wu Chen rushed to the spot with a flash of white light. But, it was already too late. Elder Taoist sucked in a long and deep breath. After that, he shifted his vision and looked towards the masked woman and other 3 people. The aura around these 4 people's bodies seemed to have become extremely feeble by this time. They had fallen to the ground, and were unable to budge even an inch. Elder Taoist Wu Chen moved quickly and swooped down. Far on the garret's roof, the golden gleam in Shi Mu's eyes dissipated and his eyes resumed their original state. A hint of excitement flashed through his eyes. That intense battle between 2 heaven-ranked powerhouses had left his blood to boil with great enthusiasm. He gazed in the direction of the sparkling gem pavilion's ruins for a moment. Then, he sprang and jumped down the garret. And, he rushed into the distance at an extremely fast speed. The old house, which was the Dark Moon cult's foothold in the heavenly U-City. The red-robed maiden was beside the black teleportation magic circle in the underground space of this old house. She was half knelt on the ground, and was soaked in a layer of fragrant sweat. Luan's silhouette seemed to be standing upright in the center of this black circle like a stone pillar. His long and blood-red hair looked like a waterfall. But, he was silent, and his head was lowered. He remained standing there for a moment. Then, he raised his head and his eyes gleamed with glaring radiance. He took a big step and strode toward the outside. "Stop!" a soft voice resounded. The red-robed maiden stood up. "Big brother, you want to throw away your life," the red-dressed maiden shouted. But, Luan's stature didn't show the slightest signs of coming to a stop, and he continued to move towards the outside. "Sister Yao and others risked their lives to save you. Do you want to let their efforts and sacrifices go in vain?" The red-dressed maiden's stature flashed and stopped in front of Luan to block his way. Luan's body received a jolt and his foot stopped. "You are the most highly talented amongst all of us. We can stage a comeback if you are alive. And, there would be the possibility of waging a war against the transcending heaven immortal cult again. Don't forget our respected master's instruction when he was in the last hours of his life," the red-dressed maiden said. Luan's body quivered as he heard the 2 words "respected master." He then held his head with his hands. "I'll come along with you if you still want to go out. I don't care whether we will live or die." 2 clear lines of tears streaked across her cheeks as she said. "Ah!" Luan raised his head upward and issued a long growl. The red-dressed maiden walked over and embraced him in a gentle manner. Luan eventually calmed down after a long time. "Big brother, let's go. We have to abandon this place now," the red-dressed maiden said. Luan's eyes had regained their normal state by now. However, they were smeared with ice-like coldness. He heard her words and nodded in a slow manner. Shi Mu's facial expression looked calm at the moment. He was advancing in the northern direction of the city. A burst of clamorous sound mixed with all kinds of voices spread from the street ahead. Shrill yelling and roaring sounds could also be heard amidst this chaos. Then, a large group of people welled up from afar and packed the streets tightly. The pedestrians soon plunged into turmoil as the people kept flooding in from afar. All the people, whether they were walking, riding a horse, or sitting in a carriage, were scurrying all over the place and bumping into each other in confusion like headless houseflies. "Run fast, there are many zombies that side. Monsters are killing people. Skeletons are everywhere." Shi Mu focused his vision and gazed through the chaotic stream of people. He could vaguely see a few lofty skeletons and zombies far behind the crowd. His mouth moved rapidly as he started to read an incantation. Then, a huge mass of white chi clouds emerged around him. The surrounding pedestrians looked surprised as they saw this. The chi clouds supported his body and flew in the air along with him. Shi Mu again continued to head in the direction of the northern city wall. He looked afar while flying over this chaotic crowd and saw that 4 human skeletons and 2 green zombies were chasing down the front crowd. Those skeletons held bone spears and blades in their hands. In addition, a dozen or more corpses of old and young people lay scattered over the street behind them. One of the spear-carrying skeletons soon caught up with a slow-moving grey-dressed old man. Then, it thrust its bone spear and pierced the spearhead deep into the old man's heart. His blood gushed out following the bone spear like spring water. Then, the skeleton flicked the bone spear and the old man's body flew to the roadside like a worn-out sack. After that, the skeleton once again ran after a pink-dressed pregnant woman with a big belly. A murderous look surfaced in Shi Mu's eyes. He stretched his right hand and pulled out the black blade from his back. The blade flared up with blazing flames the next moment. Then, Shi Mu aimed below and wielded his blade in a violent manner. 6 blazing blade lights plummeted down like meteors. They then galloped separately towards the 4 skeletons and 2 zombies. The soul flame in that skeleton's eyes flashed and the skeleton stopped. Then, each one of them received the fiery red blade light with their respective weapons. Puff! Puff! A series of mild sound was heard. The white bone spears and blades were chopped into 2 parts instantaneously. Then, the remaining strength of the blazing red blade light fell on the 4 skeletons, and chopped them into halves from top to bottom. The skeletons changed into a pile of lifeless bones in a split second as a result. The 2 green zombies' reaction time was slightly slower. Hence, they were similarly hewn into 2 sections as the red blade light touched their bodies. Then, they similarly collapsed on the roadside. Then, Shi Mu flew past the heap of bones riding his chi clouds. Many exhausted people in the fleeing crowd fell to the ground when they saw that the dead spirit creatures had been exterminated. They felt as if their limbs had become completely numb. Some of them knelt and pressed their heads to the ground facing Shi Mu's flying clouds. However, Shi Mu also landed on the roof of a 3-story garret very swiftly like a feather. Then, he mumbled something again, and a mass of white chi clouds again appeared. It held him and flew away once again. He barely flew a short distance when a crescent moon-shaped grey-colored spear edge was projected towards him from a shop below. Then, chi! Chi! An ear-piercing sound was heard near his chi clouds. Shi Mu's lips slightly moved, and a white light flashed on his body. Then, a layer of white protective shield emerged on the surface of his body. His right hand took a pinching gesture and cast a magic art at the same time. A cloud of white chi darted from his hand and bundled the skeleton cavalryman on the spot. The skeleton had barely rushed out the shop when he was tied up tightly. Then, Shi Mu's mouth slightly opened and spouted a thick white chi cloud. It bombarded on that skeleton's head like a bolt of white lightning. Bang! A rumbling sound was heard. The skeleton cavalryman's head burst into pieces, and its lofty body crashed to the ground with a loud sound. Shi Mu couldn't help but fall to the ground again. He shot a glance towards the shop and vaguely saw a few people lying prone on the ground. He decided that he shouldn't deploy the white chi cloud technique again to pass through this place. The fact was that he had finally realized that he could easily become others' target if he continued to fly in the air after this incident. His stature moved, and he once again advanced towards the north of the city by following this street. Shi Mu turned around a corner of the street after a quarter of an hour. But, he had barely turned when he saw that 4 blue Taoist robed transcending heaven immortal cult's disciples were engaged in a fierce battle with a grey-colored zombie. The grey zombie brandished its hands and a grey claw shadow darted out. A middle-aged Taoist man who stood on its opposite side waved his sword and a sword chi emerged in a crisscross pattern. And, it blocked the grey claw shadow the next moment. The other 3 young Taoist men held their respective weapons and were also dancing in a group of cold light. They continually tried to encircle, attack, and inflict injuries to that zombie. Shi Mu acted as if he hadn't seen anything. He swept past this battling group and continued to move ahead. Shi Mu finally saw the lofty northern city wall. The sky had already been smeared with darkness by this time. He constantly came across various kinds of dead spirit creatures and native people along the way. He noticed that the people were fleeing in all directions in confusion. In addition, he also encountered many martial warriors and magicians in the city who had joined hands to slaughter the dead spirit creatures. Shi Mu wouldn't have hesitated to undertake the task of exterminating these inhuman dead spirit creatures and rescue a few innocent people in a normal scenario. However, he could have run into some of the blue-colored Taoist robed elders and disciples of the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult in this process. Therefore, he had chosen to stay away from them in spite of helping them out. Luan's previous warning had made him realize that he himself was also a soul magician. And, soul magicians were considered a taboo in the eyes of the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult. Moreover, he was also a disciple of one of the branches of the Heavenly Demon sect. He had once heard Jin Xiaochai saying that the relationship between Heavenly Demon sect and Transcending Heaven Immortal cult was somewhat sensitive. Therefore, he had been keeping his profile low ever since he had stepped into this city. Moreover, the present situation was already very unusual. Therefore, Shi Mu had decided to leave the Heavenly U City in order to avoid unnecessary trouble. Shi Mu stood in front of the North City wall. He then turned around and gazed towards that 1,000 feet high small mountain in the western district of the city. He saw that a huge stream of golden light was ascending in the night sky. The glorious light and flames in the sky were illuminating the golden walls of the palace on the hilltop. He retracted his gaze and turned around. Then, his mouth moved as he read an incantation. Subsequently, a huge mass of white chi clouds wrapped him up and soared into the sky. However, a warning alarm was issued out from the broad city wall. Then, a military officer rushed out and shouted at him. Shi Mu pretended as if he hadn't heard his words. A pale white light shield appeared on his body, and he flew outside the city. Chapter 248, Beyond the Point of a Discussion. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Near the sparkling gem pavilion. The buildings within the range of thousands of feet had turned into ruins. The ground was filled with streams of blood. Numerous bones were scattered everywhere. In addition, remains of countless humans, zombies, and monsters could be seen everywhere. These things painted a general picture of purgatory. A white-haired and young-faced old man was baselessly floating in the air over these ruins. He was attired in blue trigram's Taoist robe. He was the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult's head elder Taoist Wu Chen. He held a horsetail whisk in his hand. Suddenly, it released many streaks of white lights that dashed and bound a short and silver-haired young man in a firm manner. 3 young people also lay beside this young man. A man whose face was painted red, a woman with a veil on her face, and a merchant-dressed plump man. All of them were Luan's fellow apprentices. The eyes of these 3 people looked dull since there was no radiance in them. Also, the presence of a living aura was totally lacking around them. However, not even the slightest injury could be seen on their bodies. 4 blue trigrams Taoist-robed people were also present there, 3 men, and a woman. They stood around elder Taoist Wu Chen, and seemed to be waiting for something. There was a respectful look on their faces. They could still vaguely hear the bursts of fighting sounds that seemed to be spreading from afar. One of them had a tall and plump stature. His face looked withered. He didn't seem to be a Taoist priest. Instead, he looked like a high-ranked military officer. The other man had long beard which had 3 strands. His facial features looked refined, and he had a rather stalwart appearance. The third man had a pure and elegant appearance. He had tall and upright stature. An old sword hung on his back in a slanting position. A few faint traces could be seen on the surface of its sword. The fourth and last one of them was a woman. She was a beautiful middle-aged Taoist nun. She held a white jade horsetail whisk in her hand. And, she bore a solemn expression on her face. Elder Taoist Wu Chen shook his horsetail whisk, and the short and silver-haired young man flew over and stopped in front of him. The silver-haired man looked at him, and his eyes filled with a touch of resentment. But, he was seemingly under a kind of restricting spell since he found himself unable to open his mouth and speak anything. Elder Taoist Wu Chen stretched out his left hand and his 5 fingers pressed against the silver-haired man's head like a claw. Then, his hand emitted a burst of white light. The silver-haired man's face revealed a trace of pain, and his eyes gradually got smeared with a perplexed look. Elder Taoist Wu Chen retracted his left hand a moment later. However, the silver-haired man was still tied up with the horsetail whisk. His arms were drooping alongside his body in a weak manner, and there was sluggish look in his eyes. He was completely motionless, as if he was a dead fish. The white light in Elder Taoist Wu Chen's hand brightened after some time. Then, his horsetail whisk emitted a huge mass of white flame that engulfed the silvered-haired young man. And, he was burnt to nothingness the next moment. The horsetail whisk again exuded a huge mass of white flame that fell on the bodies of the other fellow apprentices of Lu An's. And, the 3 people's bodies got submerged in a similar fashion. "Master, did you find any useful information?" the tall and plump man asked. Elder Taoist Wu Chen pondered for a moment. Then, his lips slightly moved. The surrounding 4 Taoist people clasped their hands toward the elder Taoist Wu Chen in obeisance. Then, they flew away into the distance. In a certain inn, somewhere in the heavenly Yu city, more than 20 blue trigrams Taoist-dressed transcending heaven immortal cult's follower rushed into the inn. They seemed to be headed by a tall and plump man. One of these disciples was leading a strange dog that had 6 ears and 1 strangely big nose. The inn's keeper stepped forward when he saw them. The plump Taoist man asked him a few questions. After that, one of the cult's disciples rushed to the backyard. Soon, all immortal cult's disciples appeared in one courtyard of the guest house. That strange dog sniffed in the courtyard and the room. Then, it began to bark in a furious manner. The Taoist man who had been holding the strange dog whistled loudly. Then, the dog turned around and dashed outside the inn in a crazy manner. The surrounding Taoist people's face beamed with happiness, and they quickly followed the dog. There was a vast wilderness as far as the eye could see. Green and yellow weeds seemed to be spread on the earth like a carpet. Small and shallow ponds could be occasionally seen in this wilderness. The beautiful reflection of the white clouds floating in the blue sky could be seen in the pond's water. Suddenly, a grey person's silhouette rushed through this wilderness like a predatory cheetah. This grey-dressed silhouette was none other than Shi Mu. He had just escaped from the heavenly Yu city. He had been advancing towards the north ever since he left the city. His goal was to reach the Daqin nation where the heavenly demon sect was situated. Suddenly, Shi Mu's heart thumped as the parrot Cai's voice resounded in his mind. "Shi Tou, it seems like someone is following you." His voice barely faded when a golden light flashed before Shi Mu's eyes. Then, a picture popped into his mind. He saw a team of mounted soldiers. And, they were riding sturdy horses. They were the transcending heaven immortal cult's Taoist priests. Shi Mu saw that they were currently passing a pond that Shi Mu had passed a few moments ago. Then, they galloped in the same direction that Shi Mu had been advancing in. One of the foremost Taoist priests held a strange dog that had a very ugly appearance and 6 ears. Shi Mu's heart shivered with apprehension. He pointed his right foot on the ground, and changed the direction. Half an hour later, Shi Mu was moving forward at a very high speed, but his complexion had gradually become more solemn. The fact was that he had changed direction several times in a row during this period. But, it seemed like the team of those Taoist priests had been constantly keeping watch at every action of his. Moreover, they had continued to adjust the direction accordingly, and had continued to pursue him. Shi Mu was certain that the opposite party was pursuing him only. And, he had guessed that they had been able to keep a close watch on him because of that strange dog in all probability. The real qi surged inside his body. Then, he gently pointed his foot on the ground and sprang out 10 feet forward. His speed had increased by a great margin with the passage of time. In fact, it had even surpassed the speed of a fast horse. But, the opposite party was apparently riding some rare and high-quality horses. Therefore, Shi Mu basically had no means to cast off the opposite party. On the contrary, he felt that he might end up consuming a huge amount of his real qi if he continued to run at a high speed for such a long time. Therefore, he stopped after some time. He turned around and looked in the backward direction in a silent manner. Soon, a group of 20 mounted soldiers of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult galloped over. The tall and fat blue-robed Taoist man jumped down from the horseback. He seemed to be the leader of this group. Shi Mu saw that a golden light flashed on that man's body. Then, a human-shaped magic image emerged behind him. Its whole body was covered with a suit of golden armor, and it held 2 golden hammers in its hands. Shi Mu saw this, and the 4-headed ominous python's shadow flashed on his chest. Then, a large number of black scales sprouted on the surface of his body and wrapped his whole body like the armor. Then, the aura around Shi Mu's body also increased exponentially. In fact, he had reached the peak of Xiantian summit stage in an instant. After that, a black and the red radiance bubbled up on his body. They then condensed into 2 layers of protective shields. At the same time, he took out 2 magic charms from his bosom. One was green and the other was golden in color. One of them was the golden star charm, which was drawn on the 3-headed python's skin. And, the other was the ordinary body lifting charm. He then crushed them simultaneously. The golden and the green rays of light gleamed at the same time. After that, a thin layer of green radiance and a thick layer of golden radiance also emerged on the surface of Shi Mu's body. A small and luminous star also flashed behind Shi Mu's head while he was activating the magic charm. Then, he mumbled something very fast. The next moment, a pale white protective shield emerged in front of his body, and placed itself on the outermost part of the 2 shields. Shi Mu had performed these actions in a very smooth and coherent manner. In fact, he hadn't exhibited the slightest of sloppy movements till the very end. It seemed like he had sketched out this strategy in advance. The golden armored magic image behind the plump man wielded its big hand, and a golden light darted out. It was the golden hammer that it held in his right hand. Shi Mu's right hand moved and the black blade appeared in his hand. And, the raging flames flared up on the blade's surface the next moment. Then, Shi Mu waved his right hand, and a half-moon-shaped red blade light emerged in midair. Then, it flashed and shot forward to receive the golden light. Simultaneously, his stature turned fuzzy as he shifted to the side to evade the blow. Shi Mu's current speed seemed to have reached the extreme point. It was because he had the support of the 4-headed python and the body-lifting charm at the same time. Bang! A loud rumbling sound was heard. The half-moon-shaped fiery blade light collapsed and dispersed as it came in contact with the golden light. But, the golden light didn't even stop for a second. It dashed towards Shi Mu and arrived close to him almost instantaneously. Shi Mu twisted his body and the golden light edge swept past his shoulder. However, the protective shields Shi Mu had formed outside his body were defeated and dispersed by the golden light. However, it couldn't injure Shi Mu since it had only brushed past his scales. Shi Mu only felt a sudden pain and then it quickly returned to normal. He hadn't received any severe injury apart from some minor cracks on his scales. Moreover, Shi Mu had already moved 50 or 60 feet away from his original spot. Hold on a moment before you begin. Your Excellency is presumably an elder of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult. Have I misunderstood your identity? Shi Mu opened his mouth and said. The tall and plump Taoist man examined Shi Mu a few times. Then, the trace of an unexpected look appeared on his face as he said, "Boy, you rely on many strange things. I can see that you practice both martial and magic arts pretty well. In addition, you are also quite proficient in the barbarian race's secret totem technique. Unfortunately, you have bumped into this man. So, you might as well be obedient and let yourself be captured in a peaceful manner. I might show mercy and leave your corpse intact if you tell me about Luan's whereabouts. In fact, I may also help your soul find peace." The plump man walked over as he said this, and stood in the place where Shi Mu had stood a moment ago. Then, an identical golden hammer appeared in the right hand of the golden armored magic image that was behind him. The other disciples of the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult also dismounted from their horses and rushed over. They separated into two groups and surrounded Shi Mu from either side. It appears that the elder has misunderstood me. I don't belong to the Dark Moon cult. I admit that Luan and I know each other. But, we only know each other a little. Moreover, our meeting was only a coincidence. So, I genuinely don't know anything about his whereabouts. Shi Mu slipped his left hand into his sleeves and grasped a silver-colored magic charm while he was speaking. Boy, you are good at eloquence. But, don't forget that you have fallen into this man's hand. This Taoist man naturally had a way to distinguish between true and false, the plump Taoist man replied. His voice had barely faded when the golden armored magic image's arms moved and two golden lights flashed. Suddenly, a strange thing happened. A mass of black smoke emerged in the air between these two men. Then, a person's silhouette walked out from the surging black smoke. Its whole body was covered with a suit of white armor. Its face was hidden behind a mask. It was walking in the air very swiftly even though there was no base. In fact, it seemed as if it was walking on the flat ground. It emanated a formidable aura that was as profound as a deep sea. Shi Mu saw that the silhouette walking in midair was Yan Luo in reality. His heart received a severe jolt, and his body immediately shot backwards. Boy, you are indeed a member of the Dark Moon cult. The golden armored magic image's mouth opened and issued a humming sound. Then, two golden lights fled from its hand and darted towards Yan Luo who was still amid the black smoke. But, a black light flashed on Yan Luo's body and it disappeared from the sight. The two golden lights passed through the place where Yan Luo had just stood, and went straight into the distance. Then, they exploded like two small golden suns. The plump man felt something strange, and his heart was suddenly gripped with a sense of bad premonition. He turned around along with the golden armored magic image behind him. Simultaneously, two golden hammers again appeared in the magic image's hands. He had barely completed this action when a mass of black smoke emerged not far in front of him. And, a bone spear that was covered in white flames was thrust towards him. The golden armored magic image's arms moved and gathered the two golden hammers in the middle. This action smashed the hammers against the bone spear. Bang! A loud sound rang out. Golden and the white rays of light flashed past. However, the golden hammers changed into crystal light and vanished into thin air. Then, the bone spear that was curled up in the white flames moved forward and penetrated the golden armored magic image's chest with an enormous power. Pop! A stuffy sound was heard. A hole was dug out in the golden armor magic image's chest. But then, its body armor exuded dazzling golden light that prevented the bone spear from drilling further. But, its face twisted in agony, and the golden radiance on its body also dimmed a bit. The plump man seized this opportunity and whirled around. It couldn't be said when a golden sword had appeared in his hand. Moreover, a circle of tiny magic characters were carved on the surface of this sword. The intense magic power waves proliferated in all directions like water ripples. Then, fervent and golden-colored fiery waves suddenly erupted from the sword's edge. Chapter 249, Give Me Back My Flower. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. The plump Taoist man raised his hand, and a copper-colored sword appeared in his hand. Then, a few magic characters began to flow on the surface of the sword, and the sword underwent a sharp rise. It grew to the size of a door's shutter in an instant. After that, the sword's surface radiated a dazzling golden light. In addition, blazing flames also spurted out on the surface of the sword. It seemed that the huge copper-colored sword could even split open the sky. The sword then hacked towards Yan Luo's head while carrying the overwhelming might of thunder. But, Yan Luo quickly pulled back its bone spear. Then, the black smoke coiled around its body, and its figure disappeared from the sight. Yan Luo reappeared beside the plump man the next moment. But, the copper-colored sword didn't wait for Yan Luo to make its move. It flashed over and hacked towards Yan Luo again. It had seemed as if the sword was a shadow that was following its body. The soul flame in Yan Luo's eyes flickered, and it vanished into thin air with a flash of black light. Consequently, the sword ended up empty-handed since it had hacked in the air once again. A spirit tool. Shi Mu was in the air when he saw the sword, and was left surprised by it. Shi Mu had gathered a string of information pertaining to the spirit tools when he was in the Heavenly U City. Spirit tools were regarded as special magic tools that were made from some kind of spirit materials. The only difference between the spirit tools and the magic tools was that the spirit tools could be placed within the body to slowly enhance one's inner strength as well as spirit power. Moreover, spirit tools could also stimulate the power of the spirit sense to a great extent. It would also help the user to send the spirit sense out of his body at the time of confrontation with an enemy. In fact, the user could display all kinds of offensive methods very conveniently as per his wish. In other words, the spirit tool was equivalent to a helping hand. However, the spirit materials that were used to make spirit tools were very scarce in the outside world. So, there was the possibility that they might cease to exist someday. Therefore, the tool refining experts tried to explore some other alternative methods. They researched, and soon developed a new method for refining spirit tools. An enormous consumption of spirit stones was required to refine the material in this new process of refining. This method would enable the material to absorb a great amount of spirit power. However, the spirit tools that passed through this process of refining were considered inferior to the former spirit tools. However, their strength was still considered far beyond the might of a magic tool. The fact was that most of the spirit tools that existed in this world nowadays belonged to the latter process. They were called spirit tools, but they fell into the category of artificial spirit tools in reality. Even so, it was considered a symbol of status if someone would possess an artificial spirit device. After all, the spirit tool played a crucial role in enhancing the user's strength. However, the cost of refining these spirit tools was considerably high. So, only the Earth-grade powerhouses and a few star-ranked magicians could afford to refine one for their personal use. These thoughts flashed across Shi Mu's mind for a moment. However, he then noticed that the blue-robed Taoist people around him were about to launch a converging attack on him any moment. The first wave of attack consisted of 3 misty white sword chi and 3 green-colored blade lights. They were projected towards Shi Mu from 3 different directions. Moreover, they carried an astonishing and imposing aura that had sealed off his escape routes. These attacks were mounted by 6 Yen Tian Taoist priests of the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult. After that, the remaining 10 or more Ho Tien Taoist priests encircled Shi Mu more closely. Some of them had grasped blades, and some had swords in their hands. Some people among them also held strange weapons in their hands. Their weapons were either curled up in a dense cold aura, or blazing flame, or strong wind blade light. They then bombarded towards Shi Mu from all around. However, a pale white protective shield suddenly appeared on Shi Mu's body with a flash of white light. Shi Mu didn't pay the least attention to this imminent attack that had blotted out the whole sky as they approached him. Instead, he turned around and dashed in the direction of a misty white sword chi. He flashed past this sword chi in a split second. Simultaneously, he stretched out his left hand and a cloud of white chi darted out. It took the shape of a white chi chain in midair as it rushed forward. Then, it bundled a thin and tall Taoist swordsman who had just shot this white sword chi. The trace of a petrified look flashed across the thin and tall Taoist priest's eyes. Then, green-colored real chi started to seep and bulge out of his whole body, as if he wanted to shake the white chi chain off his body. But then, a fiery red blade light flashed and hacked at this Taoist swordsman in a horizontal manner. It chopped him by the waist, and into 2 halves. A stream of blood gushed out, and spread everywhere along with his internal organs. The attacks that were made from different directions bombarded on Shi Mu's body in this meantime. A loud explosive sound rang out. The group of blade lights exploded as they fell on Shi Mu's body. This explosion prompted various kinds of rays of lights that scattered in all directions. It was also accompanied by a strong gust of wind that whistled towards the surrounding. Consequently, the pale white protective shield on Shi Mu's body began to dim at a very high speed, so much so that it could be seen with the naked eye. Then, it eventually collapsed, and the other attacks fell directly on Shi Mu's black scales. A series of rumbling sounds rang out once again along with a billowing mass of smoke. Whoosh! Shi Mu jumped out of the smoke. The upper part of his clothing had been destroyed. This had exposed his robust and muscular body that was covered with a layer of solid black scales. He stayed there for a moment. Then, he flashed and appeared in front of another Xian Tian Taoist priest like a ghost. This Taoist priest held a blade in his hand. Shi Mu flicked his arm and 13 blazing blade shadows dashed out. They galloped towards the Xian Tian Taoist priest along with the other 2 Ho Tian priests who stood beside him. 2 blood-curdling screams rang out in the air. The 2 Ho Tian Taoist priests who had surrounded Shi Mu were killed in an instant. But, the Xian Tian Taoist priest wielded his blade in a crisscrossed pattern, and dispelled Shi Mu's attacks. Then, he seized the opportunity and shot backwards to escape. However, Shi Mu spouted 2 clouds of white qi from his mouth in this meantime. The cloud of white qi was spouted from such a short distance and at such a tricky angle that it went straight, and struck the Xian Tian Taoist priest's chest. Bang! Bang! The rain of blood sprayed out everywhere. The blue-robed Taoist priest's real qi had been protecting his body. However, it was rooted and crushed. The area around his chest was blown up by the qi waves as a result. In fact, the surrounding air also got permeated with a nasty smell for a moment. Ah! Ah! Another 2 screams were heard. Another 2 Ho Tian Taoist priests appeared in Shi Mu's line of sight as the blue-robed Taoist priest was slaughtered. However, they were beheaded and thrown in a pool of blood the next moment. Suddenly, Shi Mu's whole body flashed. 3 Xian Tian Taoist priests had surrounded Shi Mu at this time. And, they had taken a pincer-like position, and had exhibited a strange attacking style. Then, 2 long blades that were curled up in a green radiance, and 1 long sword that was radiating a flickering blue radiance hacked towards Shi Mu's head. Suddenly, a mass of black smoke flashed beside Shi Mu. Then, a white-colored spear shadow darted from the black smoke and enveloped the 3 Taoist people. Ah! 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 3 short screams resounded again. 3 Xian Tian Taoist priests' bodies were inflicted with lots of holes and injuries. And, they fell to the ground as their bodies started to twitch. Then, the huge copper-colored sword that was in midair this entire time chopped down. But, Yan Luo's stature again flashed, and disappeared without a trace. This left the plump man to blaze with a fit of anger. Shi Mu seized this opportunity, and his stature charged into another black-skinned Taoist priest who held a long sword in his hand. He hadn't arrived yet, but a mountain-like stick shadow had appeared in his left hand. In addition, a cloud of billowing fire mixed with countless red blade lights had also emerged in his right hand. They then rolled out together and engulfed the opposite party. Only a couple of breaths had passed since the beginning of the battle to this very moment. However, 6 Xian Tian Taoist priests had already departed from this world in quick succession. Suddenly, a wisp of terrifying aura emerged on top of Shi Mu's head. This fervent and fiery wave made Shi Mu unable to breathe conveniently. Shi Mu's heart quivered with fear. And, he immediately drew a few steps back. He raised his head and looked up in a fierce manner. But, his pupil couldn't help but shrink the next moment. This was the huge copper-colored sword that had been chasing Yan Luo. A chi-chi sound rang out. The huge copper-colored sword plummeted down from the air like a lightning. The sword's body was wrapped up in a layer of blazing golden flame. And, it hacked towards Shi Mu at an astonishing speed. Shi Mu realized that it was impossible to evade this attack. His eyes went wide open and he roared. He connected the short stick with the blade, and a magnificent red and green light gleamed on the surface of the extended blade. Shi Mu was at the point of receiving the huge copper-colored sword in a resolute manner when a black luminescence suddenly flashed behind him. It was followed by Yan Luo's silhouette that emerged out of thin air. Shi Mu saw that a pale purple-colored soul flame throbbed in its eye sockets. Then, a mass of white flame flared up on the surface of its bone spear. After that, it seemingly changed into a white stream of light as it dashed to welcome the copper-colored sword. The two weapons were about to collide with each other when the copper-colored sword suddenly deviated from the path and twisted around the bone spear like a bolt of lightning. The blazing white flame on the bone spear's surface was curbed as it came in contact with the golden flame. And, several fine cracks also appeared on the surface of the spear as this happened. The bone spear crumbled into pieces, and turned into a grey-colored smoke. It was then set afire by the golden flame. And, it gradually vanished into thin air. The soul flame in Yan Luo's eyes throbbed. However, it didn't get enough time to plan its next move since the copper-colored sword had arrived in front of it, and had hacked towards its head. "Ha ha, evil creature! Where do you come from, and where would you go?" The plump man burst into a loud laughter. The golden armored magic image behind him looked a lot dimmed than how it was before. However, that blissful smile of his froze the next moment. He saw that Yan Luo's right hand turned fuzzy and grabbed his sword's edge. This meant that he couldn't move it again. But then, the golden flame quickly gathered on the golden sword's surface, and enveloped Yan Luo's right hand. But, Yan Luo's hand was still safe and uninjured even though it was covered in the golden flame. Yan Luo turned his head, slightly opened its mouth, and issued a soundless shout towards the plump man. The plump Taoist man's complexion profoundly changed. He turned his right hand and fished out two glittering magic charms. However, the plump man couldn't make any action as he felt that several pointed knives were suddenly thrust into his mind. A fit of acute pain and dizziness befell him. His hand trembled, and the magic charm fell down. Then, Yan Luo appeared behind him along with the black smoke. It held the golden sword in its right hand. Then, its left hand got curled up in the grey-colored smoke with an extremely fast speed. And then, another bone spear condensed out in its hand. A white light flashed. The bone spear had been thrust into the golden armored magic image that was behind the plump old man. The golden armored magic image exuded a great amount of magnificent golden light. Then, a few magic characters began to flow on the surface of the bone spear, and a white electric arc emerged. Bang! A rumbling sound was heard. The golden armored magic image eventually collapsed and dissipated after receiving several severe injuries over and over. The plump man's body shook, and his face turned pale. The trace of a petrified look also flashed through his eyes. However, he only felt a slight chill in his chest as the bone spear was thrust into his heart the next moment. A look of disbelief floated in his eyes as he looked at his chest. His feet made a few futile twitches at first. Then, he ceased to breathe. Then, Yan Luo pounded its palm and the plump man's head burst into pieces like a watermelon. Then, a mass of white light fled from his crushed head. Yan Luo opened its mouth and issued a suction force. The white light submerged in its mouth. The faint purple soul flame slightly throbbed. Then, the color of its soul flame deepened a bit. Suddenly, a string of pitiful screams rang out in the air. All Xiantian Taoist priests had been exterminated by now. So, there was no way the remaining Hotian Taoist priests could have stood any chance against Shi Mu. Thus, they were killed by Shi Mu's mountain-like stick shadow and blade shadow within a dozen or more breaths. That strange dog has run away. Suddenly, the parrot cai wah wah sound rang out from the sky. Shi Mu gazed into the distance, and saw that the dog with 6 ears had already fled 1,000 feet away. In fact, it was fleeing at an extremely high speed, and it seemed as if it was almost flying. Shi Mu tossed the black blade and short stick off his hand. Then, a splendid radiance flashed in his hands as the sky-splitting bow and an arrow appeared in his hand. He knocked the arrow with his left hand, and pulled the string. The bow bent into the shape of a crescent moon. Whiz! an arrow whistled out. The black arrow shadow flashed and covered over 1,000 feet distance in an instant. And, it pierced into that strange dog's head from behind, and nailed it firmly to the ground. Shi Mu had barely heaved a sigh of relief when he felt that an ice-cold aura had shrouded his body. He was dumbfounded by this at first. Then, he saw that Yan Luo stood not far on his left side. Its entire body was covered with a suit of white armor. Yan Luo's feet left the ground, and it floated in the air. It threw the copper-colored sword on the ground. The sword had already returned to its original shape by now. Then, the two groups of faint purple soul flames in its eyes throbbed, and the white flame flared up on the surface of the bone spear that it held in its left hand. After that, Yan Luo pointed the spear's tip towards Shi Mu from afar. "Give me back my flowers," a delightful and melodious voice of a seemingly 13 or 14-year-old girl resounded in Shi Mu's mind. Shi Mu was struck dumb for a moment. They were meeting only after a short period of time, but Yan Luo had already progressed a lot in this duration. In fact, it had advanced to the Earth grade. Even its wisdom had noticeably improved. However, Shi Mu hadn't expected that he would be asked such a question by his own summoned creature. This matter was entirely different from the information he had received from young Master Zhu back then. Shi Mu was confronted by Yan Luo's interrogation, but he had nothing to say in reply for a while. After all, he was obviously at fault when he had proposed the idea of exchanging flowers at that time. The parrot Cai was about to descend from the sky when he saw this hostile and tense situation. So, he shook his wings, and flew even higher in the sky without demur. Chapter 250, Transcending Heaven Imperial Spirit Determination. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. The aura around Yan Luo's body grew increasingly colder with each passing second. Also, the soul flame in its eyes revealed a fit of violent fluctuation. Shi Mu's heart quivered. He hurriedly stretched out his left hand and revealed a greyish-black ring that he had worn on his finger. He had obtained this ring from Zhagu's hand. This ring had been on his finger ever since he had found it. But, Shi Mu was accustomed to storing his valuable things inside his vast earth ring. "Yan Luo, this is a storage ring. You can store some of your favorite stuff inside it. It's very convenient to use. How about this thing in compensation for the loss of that flower?" Shi Mu contacted Yan Luo through his mind and explained everything in a quick manner. A light flashed in Shi Mu's left hand as he finished his words, and the sky-splitting bow disappeared from his hand. Then, another light flashed, and the sky-splitting bow appeared in his hand again. After that, Shi Mu grasped the sky-splitting bow and received it into the vast earth ring. Then, he took the ring off his left hand. The cold aura around Yan Luo's body subsided to a great extent as this happened. Even its soul flame seemed to have stabilized by a considerable margin. It gazed at the ring in Shi Mu's right hand, and crooked its head. A black light flashed and Yan Luo appeared beside Shi Mu the next moment. Then, it extended its right hand and grasped the ring that was in Shi Mu's hand. Yan Luo then imitated Shi Mu and slipped the ring on its left hand's finger. After that, a plume of grey qi galloped from its hand and wrapped the ring. Then, the grey qi dispersed. Shi Mu's spirit sense experienced a wave of fluctuation. After that, Shi Mu lost connection with Zhagu's ring. Then, a ray of light flashed on Yan Luo's ring and the long sword of a transcending heaven immortal cult's disciples disappeared from the ground. The ring flashed again, and the long sword reappeared on the ground. Yan Luo tried this a dozen times in a row. Then, it eventually stopped. It held its left hand in front of its body, and sized it up in a very careful manner. It seemed as if Yan Luo was in a very blissful mood now. "All right," the crisp and delightful voice of a girl rang in Shi Mu's mind. "Then, will you show up when I summon you again?" Shi Mu asked. Yan Luo had exhibited an exceptionally astonishing improvement in every field, whether it was its improved wisdom or cultivation. In addition, Shi Mu had also experienced the extent of Yan Luo's anger a moment ago. "It depends on my mood." Yan Luo didn't wait for Shi Mu to speak anything again, and a burst of black smoke emerged on the surface of its body. Then, its stature turned fuzzy, and it disappeared into the void. It seemed to have returned to the dead spirit world. Shi Mu remained standing in the same place, totally speechless. He shook his head to regain his composure. Then, his eyes flashed and he walked over to the place where Yan Luo had stood in an impatient manner. He saw that the copper-colored sword lay quietly on the ground. Shi Mu picked it up and saw that the sword's body was made up of a string of 108 copper coins. However, it wasn't emanating the same dazzling radiance that Shi Mu had seen before. In fact, it looked dark and gloomy. The surface of this sword was covered with a layer of small magic characters. And, each magic character had an unprecedented complexity. An idea suddenly dawned upon him, and he poured a wisp of his spirit sense into the copper-colored sword. The tiny magic characters lit up on the sword's surface. Then, a spurt of golden-colored flame flared up on the sword's surface. Shi Mu's heart brimmed with exhilaration. He then imitated the obese Taoist man and flung the copper-colored sword. The magic power surged up as a result. The copper-colored sword began to rise against the wind, and reached the size of the door's shutter. But then, the blazing golden flame darkened along with the magic characters. Then, the sword crashed to the ground like a dead thing. Shi Mu was shocked by this. He wanted to keep the sword high in the air in the same manner that the obese Taoist man had done. But, the result was very disappointing. He shook his head, picked up the sword, and stored it in his vast earth ring. Then, he went to the obese man's corpse. He rummaged his body in order to find something. He found a golden ring on his left middle finger. He also picked up a glittering golden magic charm from the ground. Shi Mu took the ring off his finger, and wore it on his left hand. He then poured a drop of his blood on it. After that, he poured his spirit into the ring in order to explore it. He was pleasantly surprised to discover that the space inside this ring was considerably larger than his own vast earth ring. In fact, the space inside was equivalent to 3 rooms. In addition, he also found a pile of spirit stones inside it. Moreover, there were several other things inside the ring. But, Shi Mu had no spare time to examine each of them right now. However, there was a golden-covered book inside the ring that had piqued his interest. He took out the book, and saw that 4 words were mentioned on its cover: Transcending Heaven, Imperial Spirit, Determination. Shi Mu was about to turn it over to have a look when the parrot's voice suddenly resounded in his mind. Shi Tou, not good. The situation doesn't look good. Hurry up, be fast. What's the matter, say it clearly. 3 more formidable Taoist priests seem to be chasing after you. They are barely 100 miles away from here. A picture popped into Shi Mu's mind the next moment. Shi Mu saw 3 Taoist priests riding unusually good-looking horses. They were passing through the hills. Judging from the surrounding scenery, it seemed that Shi Mu had passed through this place only some time before. The left one of these 3 men had 3 long strands of beard. His facial features looked mature. The person in the middle had an elegant appearance. An old sword with several marks hung on his back in a slanting position. And, the rightmost person was a beautiful Taoist nun. Shi Mu couldn't sense these 3 people's aura. But, their dressing style and the strange gleam in their eyes was enough to guess that they were Earth-grade powerhouses like the obese man from before. "Cai, I will leave this place first. You find and meet me after some time." Shi Mu's complexion looked cold. He immediately sent a message to Cai through his mind. "Shi Tou, you run quickly. They are too fast," the parrot's voice resounded again. Shi Mu received the golden-covered book and pulled out a sparkling silver magic charm. He pinched it with his fingers, and crushed it into pieces. A mass of silver radiance appeared and wrapped him up. Then, a light flashed and he disappeared from the place. A quarter of an hour later, 3 Taoist priests appeared in this battlefield. The surrounding air was pervaded with a pungent smell of blood. Badly mutilated corpses were scattered all over the place along with totally wrecked weapons. The three people's eyebrows creased as they saw this scene. The six-eared search dog. The beautiful Taoist nun dismounted and landed beside the arrow that had pierced through the strange dog's head. And, her complexion slightly changed. She then swept her eyes around. Then, her stature flashed a few times before she appeared beside the obese Taoist man's headless corpse. The mature-faced Taoist priests and elegant Taoist priest also got off their horses and walked over. Then, these two Taoist priests flipped their hands and an antique bronze mirror appeared in their hands. The mirror flashed and shot misty yellow rays of light toward the surrounding. Then, numerous densely packed silver-colored luminous dots emerged in the place from where Shi Mu had disappeared. Then, these luminous dots flashed and dispersed in the air. He has used the teleportation magic charm to leave this place nearly a quarter of an hour before. It won't be easy to catch up with him without the six-eared search dogs. The mature-faced Taoist priest shook his head. The residual deathly atmosphere of this place makes it seem that Brother Wang should have been killed by an earth-grade dead spirit creature. In addition, it also seems that the culprit should be Luan. That's because he is the only one who is capable of summoning such a formidable dead spirit creature. Also, using one strike to kill these 6 elite disciples also directs all attention towards him, the beautiful Taoist nun said. This Luan is indeed a god-blessed genius. His magic cultivation has reached the full moon realm. Perhaps, his martial arts cultivation would have also advanced to the earth-grade realm, the mature-faced Taoist priest said. Brother Wang wouldn't have received such a tragic demise in this remote and desolate hilly area if he hadn't acted so aggressively and recklessly. We should indeed blame ourselves for this. Luan couldn't have escaped if he had confronted the combined strength of we four, the elegant Taoist priest snorted coldly as he said. It's futile to talk about these things. Things have got to this point. We should better return and report this matter first, the matured-faced Taoist man suggested. These 3 people buried the bodies of the surrounding disciples of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult. Afterwards, they cremated the bones of the obese man separately in a proper manner. Then, they mounted their horses and galloped in the same direction from which they had come at lightning speed. Shi Mu stood on top of a bare mountain peak. He was gazing into the distance ahead. A dark spot had been hovering in the sky for a while. After that, it flew over toward Shi Mu and landed. It was the parrot with multiple colors on his feathers. Cai. Cai landed on Shi Mu's shoulder while flapping his wings. Shi Tou, I didn't find any traces of pursuing troops, Cai said. Shi Mu nodded since he had also seen the surrounding area through Cai's eyes. The fact was that it had been more than a month since he had killed the Earth-grade elder of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult. Initially, he had been constantly shrouded in a curtain of fear and trepidation. He had been lucky that he could cover a large distance to the north with the help of the teleportation magic charm. But, it was still difficult for him to guess whether the Taoist priests of the immortal cult had any more means to pursue him by following his traces. Shi Mu's present strength made it seem that he wouldn't be able to escape if he was caught up by those 3 Earth-grade powerhouses. Even Yan Luo's timely help couldn't rescue him. Moreover, Yan Luo had become a little strange nowadays. It seemed indifferent and cold to his summon. Therefore, Shi Mu hadn't dared to take the main route this time. He had instead followed some small paths and alleys to the north where the heavenly demon sect was located. In the meantime, he had discovered through Cai's vision that many Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult's disciples were wandering here and there. But, they didn't seem to know Shi Mu's whereabouts. So, Shi Mu was somewhat relaxed. Shi Mu had entered the territory that fell under the Great Qin Kingdom at the moment. The Great Qin nation was a medium-sized country that was bordered by the Liu Shan Kingdom. And, the heavenly demon sect was regarded as the national cult in the Great Qin Kingdom in the same way the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult was revered by the Liu Shan Kingdom. Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult and Heavenly Demon Sect had always stood against each other. However, the relationship between them wasn't as bitter as the one they had with the Dark Moon cult. Even so, bilateral disciples were unlikely to enter the opposite party's territory under normal circumstances. Therefore, the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult shouldn't dare to pursue Shi Mu here. Shi Mu finally felt relieved. He jumped down the mountain peak and advanced to the north. Shi Tou, are we heading to the Heavenly Demon Sect? Cai asked. Well, that is the Black Demon Sect's parent sect. So, we don't have to worry about being hunted again once we set foot in there, Shi Mu replied. Cai felt exhilarated as he heard his words. The fact was that Cai wasn't a courageous bird. And, he had gone through a rough time lately. So, he had been gripped with lingering fear all this time. But Shi Tou, it seems to be getting colder as we keep moving further to the north. Cai moved his wings and tightly covered his body. Is that so? But we haven't gone deep into the Great Qin Kingdom yet. It is said that most parts of the northern continent is covered with snow all year round. In fact, the Great Qin nation is also called the Nation of Ice and Snow. Shi Mu fished out a map and said. Oh! I'm very sensitive to cold, Cai replied in a complaining manner. Shi Mu didn't pay attention to Cai's words. He instead confirmed the direction on the map, and then walked forward. The Demon Yang ceremony of the Heavenly Demon Sect was close at hand. So, Shi Mu had to make the optimum utilization of the remaining time to rush over there if he wanted to attend the ceremony. Time passed. Shi Mu went into the depths of the Great Qin Kingdom over the next half a month. The terrain gradually became flatter as he walked further to the north. It was by no means autumn or winter season at present. However, there was already very little green vegetation. He could only see some bare trunks and branches. The temperature had also dropped significantly, so much so that a few pieces of snow could be seen floating in the wind on occasions. Shi Mu stood in a hilly highland, and looked towards a big city that was several miles ahead. Shi Mu had learned from his map that this city was called Auspicious River Mountain Pass. It was the first large-sized city he had encountered in the depths of the Great Qin Kingdom.